At 6:40 a.m. on a Sunday, a single photograph appeared on a niche gaming Discord server. Users initially dismissed it as a morbid prank, a hyper-realistic special effect designed for cheap shock value. But as the file rapidly duplicated across Instagram and image boards, the digital illusion fractured. The victim in the frame was real. The blood soaking the tarp was real. And the uploader wasn't an anonymous internet troll. It was the murderer himself, broadcasting his atrocity in real time. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. Utica, New York, is a fading industrial city attempting to reinvent itself. It was here that 17-year-old Bianca Devins lived a fractured existence. In the physical world, she was a quiet, deeply empathetic teenager grappling with severe psychological burdens. Diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, acute anxiety, and depression, her adolescence was punctuated by intensive therapy and multiple inpatient hospitalizations. The internal pain was sharp and relentless, yet she actively channeled that trauma into a specific ambition. Having just completed high school, she planned to attend community college in the fall to study psychology, hoping to eventually guide other adolescents through the exact darkness she navigated daily. But physical reality was only half of her world. Online, she transformed entirely. Across platforms like Instagram, Tumblr, and various obscure Discord servers, she cultivated a hyper-stylized identity. She embraced an alternative aesthetic, frequently dyeing her hair bright pastels, perfecting heavy-winged eyeliner, and posting curated, edgy photography. Through this persona, she amassed a modest but fiercely devoted following. In these unregulated digital spaces, she found a tribe. The internet offered a sanctuary where her dark humor, unfiltered thoughts, and vulnerability were celebrated by peers experiencing similar alienation. To her followers, she was an ethereal, untouchable figure. To her family, she was a beloved, albeit fragile, daughter fighting hard for baseline emotional stability. Roughly 50 miles west, in the suburban town of Cicero, 21-year-old Brandon Clark was fighting his own psychological ghosts, though his manifested as a quiet, festering resentment. His origin story was rooted in extreme, heavily publicized domestic chaos. When he was a child, his father had held his mother hostage at knife point during a grueling standoff with local law enforcement. That level of foundational trauma left indelible scars, fracturing his understanding of healthy boundaries and male-female dynamics. Unlike the girl who openly processed her pain through digital community building, Clark internalized his dysfunction. On the surface, he was remarkably unremarkable. Acquaintances described him as a cleanly dressed young man who worked menial jobs, drove a reliable sedan, and always seemed eager to please. He positioned himself as the ultimate caretaker, but that polite, subservient veneer concealed a deeply possessive ego, heavily influenced by the toxic underbelly of internet forums. He struggled to form genuine, reciprocal connections in the real world, retreating instead into the exact same shadowy online communities as his future victim. Clark viewed himself as a savior, a self-appointed white knight who just needed the right distressed maiden to validate his existence. He spent hours curating his own digital footprint, posting brooding selfies and pseudo-philosophical quotes to project an aura of misunderstood depth. He didn't just want to participate in a server, he needed a singular focal point to anchor his chaotic internal reality, someone he could rescue, someone he could manage. These two individuals were physically separated by an hour's drive down the interstate, yet fundamentally connected by the algorithmic gravity of social media. They were both scarred by their respective histories, desperately searching for validation through the glow of their monitors. One sought empathy and communal connection. The other sought total ownership disguised as romantic devotion. Their digital orbits were rapidly deteriorating, bound to intersect in a space where the treacherous line between harmless internet friendship and lethal physical obsession would completely dissolve. The algorithm functioning beneath Instagram is designed to categorize human desires, quietly funneling users toward accounts that validate their deepest psychological patterns. In April 2019, this code bridged the gap between Utica and Cicero. He found her profile not by accident, but because his digital footprint heavily indexed on the alternative, highly vulnerable aesthetic she projected. He initiated contact through a direct message. It was a calculated entry, not aggressive, not overtly flirtatious. He bypassed the usual noise in a teenage girl's inbox by positioning himself as an empathetic, objective listener. To an adolescent navigating the erratic emotional swings of borderline personality disorder, consistency feels like a lifeline. He provided exactly that. He was always online, his typing indicator pulsing with immediate responses at all hours of the night. He validated her frustrations, listened quietly as she dissected her therapy sessions, and offered the kind of undivided attention that feels intoxicating to an isolated mind. Within weeks, the relationship breached the digital perimeter. The transition to the physical world was heavily managed by him. He willingly drove the 50 miles to her hometown, initiating face-to-face meetups that were strictly framed around her comfort. He rapidly became a fixture in her physical reality. He acted as her personal chauffeur, picking her up for mundane errands, driving her to appointments, and consistently paying for meals. He integrated himself so thoroughly into her routine that her family quickly grew accustomed to his presence. To her mother, the 21-year-old appeared to be a stabilizing force, a polite, softly spoken young man who drove a reliable sedan and kept a watchful eye on her daughter. He assured her family that his intentions were purely protective, but a fundamental miscalculation was quietly rotting the foundation of their dynamic. She was brutally honest about her boundaries. She communicated to him without any ambiguity that she was not seeking a romantic partner. She explicitly stated she lacked the emotional bandwidth for a boyfriend and valued him strictly as a reliable, platonic anchor. He nodded, agreed, and outwardly accepted this designation. Internally, he rejected it entirely. In his psychological framework, the friend zone was merely a temporary waiting room. He operated on a highly transactional theory of human connection, heavily reinforced by the bitter, insular online subcultures he frequented. He believed his time, his mileage, and his financial investments were currency. That by playing the ultimate caretaker, he was slowly purchasing a monopoly on her affection. Every favor was a logged debt. Every car ride was an anchor tying her closer to his reality. As spring bled into summer, his surveillance escalated. While they spent hours together in person, her primary social life still existed on Discord. She was an active participant in sprawling voice channels, interacting with dozens of other users across the country. She was naturally charismatic, occasionally flirtatious in the detached, ironic style of her peer group. He watched this from the digital sidelines. He tracked her login times, monitored her public interactions, and noted exactly who she was speaking with. His white knight complex began mutating into something resembling a warden's paranoia. He grew deeply resentful of the attention she freely gave to internet strangers, attention he felt he had exclusively earned through his physical labor. The simmering tension required a catalyst. It arrived in the form of a concert announcement. Nicole Garcia, an artist deeply embedded in her preferred aesthetic, was scheduled to perform in Queens, New York in mid-July. For a 17-year-old in upstate New York, a concert 250 miles away is a logistical impossibility. For the self-appointed caretaker, it was the ultimate opportunity to cement his indispensability. He immediately volunteered to facilitate the trip. He would provide the vehicle, handle the grueling 5-hour drive down the interstate, and secure the tickets. It was a massive undertaking, framed entirely as a selfless act of devotion. But the parameters of the trip shifted drastically just days before departure. She casually informed him that the concert wouldn't just be the two of them. She had been speaking with another male user from one of her Discord servers, someone closer to her own age, and they had arranged to meet up at the venue. The tectonic plates of his ego fractured. The transactional ledger in his mind flashed deeply in the red. He was absorbing the cost, doing the heavy lifting, navigating the traffic and the exhaustion, only to deliver her into the arms of a digital rival. Outwardly, he maintained the facade. He calmly told her it was perfectly fine, that he was simply happy to get her to the show. He packed his sedan, filled the gas tank, and prepared for the journey south. He also packed a large, heavy-duty tarp, a length of rope, and a hunting knife with a meticulously sharpened blade. He placed them in the trunk of his car, right next to the jumper cables and spare tire. silent insurance policies for a transaction he refused to lose. The July heat was oppressive, hanging in the air like a damp wool blanket as the sedan merged onto the interstate. It was Saturday, the 13th, the day of the Nicole Garcia concert. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was a study in profound psychological contrast. In the passenger seat, the teenager was radiant, her attention absorbed by the glowing screen of her smartphone as she coordinated logistics with her digital peers. She was stepping out of her isolated, therapeutic routine and into a space where her online aesthetic matched the physical environment. Behind the wheel, the driver was physically present, but psychologically retreating into a dark, rigid tunnel of his own design. He maintained the facade of the benevolent caretaker, adjusting the air conditioning and navigating the grueling 250-mile stretch of asphalt heading south toward the city. But the silence between them was heavy. He gripped the steering wheel, calculating the exact emotional cost of the fuel, the mileage, and the hours he was sacrificing. The hunting knife and the tarp rested in the trunk, vibrating slightly with the hum of the tires over the pavement. They were his contingency plan, the absolute guarantee that if he could not secure her affection, he would retain ultimate control over her fate. By the time they navigated the congested concrete labyrinth of Queens and located the venue, the sun had set, and the sticky urban humidity had taken over. The venue was a sensory overload, throbbing bass lines, erratic strobe lights, and a sea of tightly packed bodies. For her, it was a manifestation of the digital subculture she adored. But for him, the environment was alienating and deeply threatening. The fracture in his ego occurred almost immediately upon their arrival. The young man from the Discord server materialized from the crowd. He was closer to her age, effortlessly fluent in the same internet dialect, and entirely unburdened by the heavy, suffocating expectations that the driver carried. The dynamic shifted instantly. The self-appointed savior was relegated to the periphery, standing rigidly in the shadows while the two teenagers bonded over the music. He was forced to watch as the girl he considered his exclusive property laughed, danced, and engaged with a rival who had invested none of the physical labor he believed was required to earn her presence. The fatal catalyst was brief, completely devoid of malice, and entirely normal for two teenagers at a summer concert. Amidst the flashing lights and the crush of the crowd, they shared a kiss. It was a fleeting moment of adolescent exploration. She owed no loyalty. She had firmly and repeatedly established that she was single and unavailable for a committed relationship. But to the man watching from the edge of the dance floor, the kiss was a declaration of psychological war. It invalidated every mile he had driven. It erased every favor he had performed. In his rigid, transactional worldview, she had taken his currency and spent it on a stranger. The dam holding back his festering resentment completely collapsed. He did not confront them. He did not cause a scene. He simply absorbed the perceived humiliation, internalizing the rage, his mind locking with terrifying clarity onto the heavy-duty plastic and sharpened steel waiting in the trunk of his vehicle. The concert ended in the early hours of Sunday morning. The Discord acquaintance departed, melting back into the city, leaving the two original travelers to begin the long journey north. The drive back was an exercise in agonizing, protracted tension. The clock slipped past 2 a.m., then 3 a.m. Outside, the urban sprawl gave way to the pitch-black void of the upstate highways. The rhythmic thumping of the tires and the hypnotic glare of oncoming headlights amplified the claustrophobia inside the sedan. Exhausted from the adrenaline of the show, she eventually tilted her head against the passenger window and drifted into an uneasy sleep. He drove in absolute silence. The dashboard illuminated his rigid features. He was no longer a chaperone ferrying a friend. He was an executioner transporting a target. He had hours to process the perceived betrayal, hours to let the fury crystallize into a cold, methodical resolution. As the sky began to bleed into a bruised pre-dawn gray, they approached the city limits of Utica. She stirred, the familiar landmarks signaling that she was finally home. But the vehicle did not take the standard route toward her neighborhood. Instead, the sedan veered sharply, tires gripping the asphalt as he guided the car toward the forested, desolate fringes of the city. He turned onto Post Street, a secluded, dead-end road heavily flanked by dense, overgrown woods. It was a place devoid of streetlights, isolated from the early morning traffic, and completely silent. She realized instantly that the geography was wrong. The confusion morphed into acute alarm as the engine cut out, plunging the cabin into a heavy, suffocating stillness. The argument ignited like gasoline. He aggressively confronted her about the concert, his voice low but vibrating with barely contained violence. He demanded accountability for the kiss, interrogating her about the disrespect she had shown him after everything he had sacrificed. She did not cower. Despite the physical disadvantage and the isolation of the dead-end street, she defended her autonomy. She firmly reiterated the boundaries she had set months prior, reminding him that she was not his girlfriend, she was not his property, and she had every right to interact with whoever she chose. Her refusal to submit, her absolute rejection of his fabricated romantic narrative, was the final trigger. The transition from verbal conflict to physical atrocity was instantaneous. He lunged. The confined space of the sedan erupted into frantic, brutal chaos. She fought back desperately, her hands coming up in a frantic attempt to deflect the assault, resulting in severe defensive lacerations. But the physical disparity was insurmountable. He retrieved the hunting knife. The struggle culminated in a single, devastating strike to her neck, a wound so severe it immediately neutralized any possibility of survival. The heavy metallic scent of copper flooded the air-conditioned cabin. The violent thrashing ceased, replaced by the terrifying, profound silence of the surrounding woods. The murder itself was horrific, but what followed elevated the crime from a localized tragedy to a modern psychological nightmare. The adrenaline of the physical struggle quickly dissipated, replaced by a chillingly clinical objective. He did not panic. He did not immediately attempt to flee or conceal the atrocity. Instead, covered in the physical evidence of his violence, he reached for his smartphone. His priority was not self-preservation, it was digital broadcast. He carefully positioned the device, utilizing the dim, muted light of the early morning to frame the interior of the vehicle. He adjusted the angle, ensuring the catastrophic severity of her injuries and the lifeless state of her body were undeniably visible. He snapped the photograph. He then opened the Discord application, navigating directly to the server where her friends, her followers, and the boy from the concert were currently active. He uploaded the image. He attached a brief, venomous caption directly mocking her digital community, apologizing sarcastically that they would have to find a new girl to obsess over. He hit send. With a single tap on a glass screen, he weaponized her murder. He bypassed the physical isolation of Poe Street and thrust the gruesome reality of his possession directly into the feeds of thousands of unsuspecting teenagers, ensuring that his final act of control would be permanently burned into the internet's collective memory. The notification arrived like a digital contagion. By 7 a.m., the first frantic calls reached the Utica Police Department. They came not from locals, but from residents of distant states, Discord users who had been active in the same private voice channels where the images were seeded. These callers were hysterical, describing a photograph of a brutalized young woman that was circulating with the speed of an unchecked virus. Dispatchers, initially struggling to process the chaotic, overlapping reports, began the grim process of cross-referencing locations. The servers where the images originated were non-geographical, but the metadata and the frantic chatter of the users pinned the tragedy to the sprawling, wooded outskirts of Oneida County. As officers were dispatched to verify the reports, the digital ecosystem exploded. The image of the victim was not just being shared, it was being weaponized. It was reshared as a trophy on 4chan, repurposed for shock value on Instagram, and dissected by morbid curiosity seekers on Twitter. The transition from a virtual horror to a tactical reality was agonizing. Local police had to move through a dense, unforgiving landscape. The location was a dead-end maintenance road deep within the woods, a spot typically utilized for illegal dumping or underage drinking. As the first squad cars pulled off the pavement and onto the gravel, they weren't just looking for a crime scene. They were racing against the internet's ability to desensitize millions of people to a girl's murder. Every minute wasted was another 1,000 views for the image. The officers moved in a tight, cautious formation, weapons drawn, anticipating an active threat. They found the vehicle, a reliable, unremarkable sedan, idling near the tree line. The car was a stark, silent witness to the carnage. The driver's side door hung open. The surrounding grass was matted with the evidence of a violent struggle that had occurred hours earlier. The search for the body became secondary to the desperate need to contain the digital spread. The department had never dealt with a crime where the evidence was essentially being live-streamed to an international audience. They had to balance the preservation of a physical scene with the terrifying, intangible reality that the crime was already public domain. They were walking into a nightmare that had already been formatted for public consumption. The officers moved further into the brush, their flashlights cutting through the thick morning mist. The terrain was treacherous, littered with thickets and uneven, rocky ground that made standard tactical formations nearly impossible. They were looking for any sign of movement, any sign of life, but the woods were unnervingly quiet. The silence was absolute, a profound contrast to the cacophony of digital alerts that were currently flooding the phones of every officer on the scene. They located him near a patch of trees about 50 feet from the vehicle. He was not trying to escape. He was not attempting to hide. He was actively attempting to end his own life, a frantic, disorganized sequence of self-inflicted wounds that left him bloodied and trembling in the dirt. He was positioned as if waiting for the authorities to arrive, a final macabre performance for an audience of one. The standoff lasted for several agonizing minutes. Officers barked commands, their voices tight with the adrenaline of the situation. He ignored them, his focus entirely on his own mortality, his movements erratic and desperate. The scene was a grotesque tableau, the perpetrator broken and failing in his suicide attempt, just feet away from the discarded, lifeless form of the teenager he had spent months obsessively stalking. The investigators moved in, securing the perimeter and finally disarming him, though the damage was already absolute. With the perpetrator in custody and the grim reality of the victim's passing confirmed, the focus shifted to the logistics of the investigation. The woods were sealed off. Forensics teams began the painstaking, delicate process of documenting a scene that had already been documented by the murderer himself. Every piece of physical evidence, the knife, the tarp, the positioning of the body, was cataloged against the digital evidence that was still circulating globally. It was an unprecedented, nightmarish overlap of traditional law enforcement and the unchecked volatility of the internet. The public's involvement in the search had not ended with the discovery. It had merely transitioned into a different phase of morbid participation. Users who had been following the situation in real time on Discord began attempting to play detective, scouring the web for any additional scraps of information, harassing the victim's family members for updates, and creating endless threads of speculation that clouded the official investigation. The local police were effectively besieged. They were trying to conduct a professional investigation while being harassed by a digital mob that felt entitled to every shred of information. The search team found additional evidence scattered through the woods, items that the perpetrator had seemingly discarded in a frantic attempt to dissociate from the scene. Personal belongings, pieces of clothing, and remnants of the trip they had taken from Queens were recovered, tracing the timeline of the final lethal detour. Each item recovered by the police was already being discussed and analyzed by thousands of anonymous voices online. The sense of violation was not limited to the physical assault. The entire incident was a violation of the victim's final moments of privacy. By midday, the news had officially broken, and the local community began to grapple with the scale of what had occurred. It was not just a homicide in a local forest, it was a digital execution. The parents, the friends, and the classmates of the teenager were not just mourning a sudden death. They were dealing with the fact that millions of strangers had seen their loved one in her most vulnerable, final moments. The search for justice had begun, but it was already tainted, forever associated with the viral, voyeuristic nightmare that had accompanied it from the very first notification. The authorities worked with a singular, grueling focus to ensure that the man responsible for this carnage was held accountable, and that the digital trail he left behind was used not just to prove his guilt, but to dismantle the twisted, entitled logic that had driven him to the woods that night. The sharp, metallic scent of copper hung heavy in the stagnant summer air as the standoff abruptly concluded. Paramedics rushed the tree line, loading the bleeding suspect onto a gurney. His self-inflicted neck wound was severe, requiring immediate transport to a nearby trauma center, leaving the physical crime scene to the detectives. Under the harsh, sterile glare of halogen work lights set up by the forensics unit, the true scope of the premeditation began to surface. The narrative of a spontaneous crime of passion dissolved the moment investigators opened the trunk of the idling sedan. Tucked beneath standard emergency supplies lay a heavy-duty green tarp, coils of industrial paracord, and empty packaging for the survival knife currently resting in the blood-soaked grass. This equipment had traveled 250 miles down the interstate and back, silent passengers waiting for their cue. But the most damning piece of physical evidence was found on the asphalt itself. Detectives noticed fresh, neon-colored spray paint scrawled across the dead-end turnaround. The suspect had painted a theatrical, self-pitying message on the ground, essentially signing his work. He had brought the aerosol cans with him. He had orchestrated the lighting, the location, and the props before the fatal strike was even delivered. While the physical processing of the site was methodical and absolute, the digital investigation was a catastrophic, unprecedented nightmare. Back at the precinct, the investigative infrastructure was collapsing under an avalanche of internet interference. Typically, law enforcement begs for public assistance in homicide cases. Here, they were drowning in a toxic flood of it. The department's switchboards were paralyzed by thousands of incoming calls from across the country. Trolls from anonymous image boards flooded the lines, claiming responsibility for the murder or fabricating elaborate narratives about a coordinated cult ritual. These digital red herrings drained massive investigative resources. Cybercrime units were forced to track frantic tips regarding an alleged third accomplice visible in the background of the uploaded photograph. Detectives wasted precious high-adrenaline hours subpoenaing internet service providers and tracing IP addresses, only to breach a basement halfway across the continent to find a teenager who had doctored the image in Photoshop for online clout. The police were hunting phantoms. They were forced to navigate a labyrinth of disinformation, fully aware that the actual killer was currently sedated under police guard in a hospital room across town. The friction between local law enforcement and Silicon Valley tech giants escalated into a bitter, high-stakes battle. The physical homicide was solved, but the digital assault was ongoing. The lead detective assigned a dedicated task force strictly to handle social media containment. They drafted emergency warrants to Discord and Instagram, demanding the immediate suspension of the perpetrators' profiles and the erasure of the horrific imagery. But bureaucratic legal channels could not outpace algorithmic virality. By the time a corporate moderator on the West Coast approved the deletion, the image had been replicated by tens of thousands of burner accounts. Malicious users were actively exploiting auto-tagging systems, burying the gruesome photograph under trending benign hashtags to ambush unsuspecting viewers. The investigative team realized with a sinking dread that they were fighting a hydra. Every time they scrubbed one server, 3 more emerged. They were no longer just detectives. They had become unwilling content moderators in a psychological war zone. Once stabilized from emergency surgery, the suspect awoke in his hospital bed. His vocal cords were heavily damaged, but he was lucid. Detectives positioned themselves at the foot of the bed to conduct the initial interrogation. He communicated through raspy, strained whispers and hastily scribbled notes on a medical clipboard. He attempted to sell them the narrative of a heartbroken, marginalized romantic, claiming the violence was a blind, uncontrollable reaction to the perceived betrayal at the concert. The seasoned investigators remained entirely impassive. They did not argue, nor did they raise their voices. They simply laid out the inventory from his vehicle. They listed the tarp, the paracord, the freshly sprayed graffiti. They presented the timestamp data from his own digital footprint, outlining how methodically he had positioned his phone to capture the aftermath before alerting his online audience. The medical examiner's preliminary report arrived shortly after, obliterating any remaining illusions of a chaotic scuffle. The autopsy confirmed that the fatal strike required immense, calculated force and precise targeting. Furthermore, digital forensics had successfully extracted the search history from his seized electronics. In the weeks leading up to the concert, he had quietly queried the exact anatomical vulnerabilities of the human neck. He had meticulously researched the most isolated, unlit maintenance roads within a 10-mile radius of the victim's home. He was cornered by his own data. The facade of the overwhelmed caretaker crumbled, exposing a cold, methodical predator who had viewed his victim not as a human being, but as a captive audience for his final gruesome broadcast. The legal machinery ground forward with unusual speed, driven entirely by the insurmountable weight of the defendant's own documentation. Facing an ironclad indictment for second-degree murder, the defense had virtually no leverage. Early the following year, the perpetrator entered a guilty plea, claiming a desire to spare the victim's family the agonizing theater of a public trial. It was a fleeting illusion of accountability. Months later, he abruptly petitioned the court to withdraw his plea, citing inadequate legal representation. The maneuver was recognized by the prosecution not as a genuine quest for justice, but as a final, desperate flex of control, a calculated attempt to drag the devastated family back into the spotlight. The presiding judge firmly rejected the delay tactics. In March 2021, the sentence was handed down: 25 years to life in a state penitentiary. The legal chapter was definitively closed. Yet for the grieving parents, the courtroom victory offered hollow comfort. The gavel could lock the murderer in a concrete cell, but it could not erase the digital footprint he left behind. They were handed a permanent, modern life sentence of their own, navigating a reality where their worst nightmare remained permanently archived online. The true horror of this case extends far beyond the physical violence inflicted in an isolated upstate forest. It lies in the terrifying realization that the digital realm can weaponize grief, transforming a private tragedy into a public spectacle. Refusing to be broken by anonymous harassment, the victim's family channeled their devastation into aggressive legislative action. They successfully campaigned for state laws that criminalize the sharing of graphic, exploitative imagery of victims, forcing tech platforms to finally bear legal responsibility for the content they host. The physical perpetrator sits behind bars, but the battle against the algorithmic apathy that amplified his crime continues. It serves as a permanent, grim reminder that the darkest components of human nature are never truly contained behind a glass screen. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. At 8:20 a.m. on a quiet suburban street, the morning school run stands as the ultimate symbol of safety. Children strapped into car seats, backpacks on the floorboards, a mother at the wheel. But on February 19th, 2020, that sanctuary was instantly vaporized. Residents of Camp Hill were jolted by an explosion, followed by a thick wall of black smoke. A white SUV was entirely engulfed in flames, with 3 young children and their mother trapped inside. It wasn't a mechanical failure, it was an ambush. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. Rowan Baxter's identity was constructed on an entirely different foundation: the exertion of absolute physical dominance. A native of New Zealand, he carved out a space for himself on the brutal, high-impact battlefields of professional rugby league. Earning a contract with the New Zealand Warriors, he lived in a world where aggression was monetized and vulnerability was an exploitable weakness. When his professional sporting career eventually faded, he seamlessly pivoted into the local fitness industry, bringing that same combative intensity with him. Baxter was the quintessential charismatic coach. He possessed the heavily muscled physique, the confident swagger, and the loud motivational rhetoric that commanded immediate attention on the gym floor. To the casual observer, he was an inspirational figure, a man of unwavering discipline who could push clients to their absolute limits. But the psychological framework required to survive professional contact, sports often conceals a dangerous rigidity. The traits that ensure survival on the field, a refusal to yield, an obsession with winning, the demand for total environmental control, can become a catastrophic liability behind closed doors. Baxter didn't simply prefer having his way, he required total submission. His charm was not a reflection of empathy. It was a highly effective tactical instrument. He used it to disarm critics, attract followers, and mask a deeply ingrained narcissism. Those who spent enough time in his orbit eventually noticed that his affability was purely conditional. As long as you followed his script and validated his superiority, he was the perfect gentleman. The moment you deviated, the warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating punisher. Hannah's dedication to health and physical training meant her path was destined to cross with the local fitness community's elite. As she navigated her 20s, she was actively looking to build a vibrant, healthy life. She wanted a true partnership, someone to share early morning workouts, family dinners, and the eventual responsibilities of raising children. She brought an open, trusting vulnerability to her interactions, assuming others operated with the same fundamental decency she did. Baxter, conversely, was scanning the horizon for something very different. He wasn't seeking an equal, he was looking for an asset. He needed a partner who would elevate his social status, reflect his obsession with physical perfection, and most importantly, submit entirely to his governance. The stage was set for a devastating collision between a woman who lived to nurture and a man who lived only to conquer. The connection occurred in the exact environment where both felt most formidable, the gym floor. In the late 2000s, Hannah was an energetic, highly respected presence in the local fitness community, while Baxter was transitioning out of his professional rugby career into personal training. Their introduction seemed entirely organic. To Hannah, Rowan appeared as a driven, passionate athlete who inherently understood her intense dedication to health. He mirrored her interests flawlessly, matching her vibrant energy with his own brand of extreme focus. During those early months, the attention he showered on her felt intoxicating. He was protective, deeply interested in her daily routines, and seemingly devoted to building a shared future. It is a psychological hallmark of coercive control. The initial phase is rarely marked by fear. Instead, it is characterized by an overwhelming, all-consuming affection that quietly begins to sever a victim's outside ties under the guise of an inseparable romance. They married in 2012, cementing what appeared to the public to be a flawless partnership. Over the next few years, the couple welcomed 3 children into their lives. On paper, they were a modern suburban success story. They combined their professional passions to open a fitness center. To the casual member walking through the doors, the owners were a powerhouse duo. They built a lucrative brand around physical excellence, strict discipline, and wholesome family values. But the business served a much darker, dual purpose for Rowan. It was not simply a source of joint income. It was an architectural mechanism for total financial and professional surveillance. Because they worked in the same building, Hannah was never out of his sight. He positioned himself as the face and primary authority of the gym, while systematically reducing his wife to a subordinate administrative role. He controlled the company's finances, which seamlessly translated into absolute control over her personal access to money. The isolation began with imperceptible, highly calculated shifts. A disparaging comment about a lifelong friend here, a manufactured, exhausting argument before a family gathering there. Baxter subtly manipulated the domestic environment so that Hannah found it easier to simply stay home rather than endure the inevitable conflict of socializing without him. He required her to delete her personal social media accounts, replacing them with a joint profile that he monitored constantly. He scrutinized her wardrobe, dictating exactly what was appropriate for a mother and a fitness professional to wear. If she wore athletic gear that he deemed too revealing, he would publicly humiliate her in front of gym members, framing his aggressive jealousy as a righteous standard of professional modesty. The psychological grip tightened relentlessly as the years progressed. Baxter began tracking her movements using phone applications and GPS tracking under the heavy-handed pretense of keeping her safe. He would intercept her text messages and demand passwords to every digital facet of her life. The financial abuse deepened into absolute deprivation. Hannah was not allowed access to their joint bank accounts without his explicit, itemized permission. She was forced to ask for grocery money. When she was permitted to go to the supermarket, he timed her trips down to the minute. If she took too long, she returned to a barrage of interrogations and wild accusations of infidelity. He weaponized intimacy and his sheer physical size, standing in doorways to block her exit during arguments, using his heavily muscled frame to physically intimidate without ever throwing a punch. This was a deliberate, chilling calculation. He knew exactly how to inflict maximum emotional terror without leaving the physical bruises that law enforcement could easily act upon. He constantly told her that she was nothing without him, that her family didn't actually care about her, and that she was an incompetent mother. Over a decade, this relentless psychological battery eroded her self-esteem, trapping her in a claustrophobic labyrinth of self-doubt and manufactured guilt. By late 2019, the atmosphere inside their home had become suffocating. The emotional terror was absolute, and it was no longer contained just to Hannah. Baxter began subjecting the children to his rigid, unpredictable demands, using them as emotional pawns to punish their mother. If she stepped out of line, he withheld affection from the kids or leveraged their natural love for him against her. It was this specific dynamic that finally snapped the tether. Hannah realized that her children were absorbing this toxicity as their baseline for normalcy, that her daughters were learning this was what a relationship looked like, and her son was being taught that this was how a man asserts power. Hannah began quietly laying the groundwork for an exit. It required terrifying precision. Victims of coercive control understand that the most dangerous moment of their lives is the exact point of departure. She secretly confided in her parents, finally peeling back the curtain on the true extent of her captivity. Her family immediately rallied, providing an unconditional safe haven. In early December 2019, seizing a narrow window of opportunity while her husband was distracted, Hannah executed her escape. She packed whatever essentials she could quickly fit into her vehicle, strapped the children into their car seats, and drove away from the marital home. She left behind the business she helped build, her financial security, and the hollow illusion of the perfect family. She sought immediate refuge at her parents' house, moving to file for a domestic violence order and initiating the harrowing process of untangling her life from a man who viewed her not as a human being, but as his exclusive property. He was waiting, hidden from view, tracking her daily routine with the cold precision of a predator. He had calculated the exact route, the exact intersection, the exact moment of maximum vulnerability. As the heavy vehicle slowed near a corner, the passenger door was suddenly and violently yanked open. He forced his way inside. The intrusion was physical, immediate, and utterly calculated. He didn't come to argue. He didn't come to negotiate custody or plead for reconciliation. He came with a heavy plastic jerry can. Panic instantly flooded the confined cabin. Realizing the catastrophic threat sitting mere inches away, she gripped the steering wheel and mashed her foot against the accelerator. The engine roared. The SUV lurched violently forward, jumping the concrete curb. She deliberately drove the vehicle into a neighbor's parked car, hoping the jarring impact of the crash would stall his momentum, hoping the crunch of twisting metal would draw the neighborhood outside. It did not stop him. He ignored the collision. He unscrewed the cap. He tipped the heavy container. Gallons of liquid splashed violently across the center console. It soaked the upholstery. It saturated her clothing. The fluid splashed backward into the rear cabin where the 3 children were firmly strapped down. The heavy, noxious fumes sucked the oxygen from the enclosed space instantly. The smell of unleaded gasoline was suffocating, chemical, sharp, burning the eyes and lungs, signaling absolute doom. He produced a lighter. The flick of the flint was barely audible over the screaming. Then, ignition. Fire does not simply burn in a confined space drenched in chemical accelerant. It detonates. The interior of the SUV transformed instantly into a roaring inferno. Temperatures inside the cabin spiked to thousands of degrees Fahrenheit within fractions of a second. The air itself caught fire. The massive displacement of thermal pressure blew the tempered safety windows outward, showering the asphalt with shattered glass. A thick, impenetrable wall of black, toxic smoke aggressively spiraled into the sky, blotting out the morning sun. Inside the vehicle, survival became a physiological impossibility. The heat was absolute. Plastic dashboard fixtures warped, bubbled, and liquefied. The heavy-duty nylon seatbelts fused and locked. The electronic wiring of the doors fried instantly, turning the heavy metal frame into an inescapable cage. The child locks remained engaged. The vehicle became a vault of fire. Through sheer, unimaginable adrenaline, she somehow managed to force her door open. She tumbled out onto the hard asphalt. Her clothing was heavily alight. She rolled on the pavement, screaming for her children, the desperate maternal instinct overriding the total destruction of her own body. The neighborhood, jolted by the explosive concussion and the grinding crash, rushed from their homes. A man who had been washing his car dropped his sponge and sprinted toward the blazing wreckage with a garden hose, spraying water over her charred form, desperately trying to extinguish the flames eating through her skin. Another resident grabbed a household fire extinguisher, rushing the vehicle, trying to penetrate the wall of heat to reach the back seat. It was utterly futile. The thermal radiation was too intense. The sheer wall of heat pushed them backward, singeing their hair, blistering their faces. Approaching within 10 feet felt like stepping into an open blast furnace. The roaring jet engine sound of the chemical fire drowned out all reason. And then there was the assailant. He had managed to exit the passenger side. His own body was severely burned, but he was highly mobile. He did not move to help. He did not move to open the rear doors. Instead, he aggressively returned to the burning wreckage to retrieve a knife from the front seat. When panicked neighbors tried to intervene, when they tried to drag the garden hose closer to the windows, he physically charged at them. He stood as a barrier between the rescuers and the burning tomb of his own children. He shouted at the bystanders, commanding them to back away. He demanded that the destruction run its full course. Realizing the fire had completed its horrific task, he finally stepped away from the inferno. He stumbled toward the sidewalk, collapsing onto the concrete just a few yards from the burning metal. Gripping the blade he had retrieved from the cabin, he inflicted a fatal wound to his own chest. He bled out onto the pavement, ensuring he would never face a courtroom, never look a jury in the eye, and never answer for the massacre. It was his final, cowardly assertion of absolute control. But the mother did not die on the asphalt. Her physical injuries were catastrophic. Deep, full-thickness burns covered 97% of her body. The pain receptors in her skin were completely incinerated, leaving her in a terrifying state of hyperlucid shock. As emergency sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, echoing off the suburban houses, she sat upright on the curb. Bystanders continued to pour buckets of water over her smoking frame, weeping openly, paralyzed by the sheer horror of the tableau. When the first police cruisers screeched to a halt and paramedics rushed the scene with medical kits, they expected a victim succumbing to the overwhelming trauma. They expected incoherence, unconsciousness, or delirium. Instead, they found a woman powered by a terrifying final surge of protective rage. She looked directly at the first responders. Her voice was remarkably steady, cutting clearly through the chaos, the crackling of the dying fire, and the frantic shouts of the tactical units securing the perimeter. She did not ask for painkillers. She did not ask about her own survival. She gave them the complete narrative of the crime in precise, declarative statements. She told the officers that he poured the fuel. She told them that he ignited the flame. She explicitly gave them his identity, ensuring the legal record would reflect his exact actions. Even as her organs began to fail and her body shut down, her mind remained razor sharp. She ensured that the narrative of this day would never belong to him. She made certain there would be no ambiguity, no alternative police theories, and no post-mortem defense of a tragic accident. She delivered her own dying declaration with perfect clarity. Only after the paramedics loaded her onto the stretcher, initiating aggressive airway management and pumping her veins with heavy narcotics, did that superhuman adrenaline finally begin to ebb. The fire eventually smothered itself, starved of its chemical accelerant, leaving behind a blackened, smoking steel skeleton sitting incongruously on a manicured suburban street. Water from the frantic, futile rescue attempts pooled with oil and gasoline runoff, forming a toxic, iridescent slurry that trickled slowly into the storm drains. The acrid stench of melted plastic, scorched rubber, and unspent fuel hung heavy in the warm morning air. A permanent sensory anchor that would haunt the responding officers for the rest of their careers. For the residents of Camp Hill, the inherent safety of their neighborhood had been permanently shattered. Bystanders who had sprinted from their driveways, armed with nothing but household fire extinguishers and desperate courage, now stood paralyzed behind expanding rings of yellow police tape. The adrenaline crash left them shivering despite the heat. Men who had charged the inferno, blistering their own hands on the superheated door handles, sat on the curbs in stunned silence. Some wept openly into their shirts. Others stared vacantly at the wreckage, their minds unable to process the absolute failure of their intervention. The social echo of the event was immediate and profound. They had not merely witnessed a tragedy, they had been forced into the front row of a calculated massacre, helpless to stop the obliteration of a mother and her children. Uniformed officers rapidly locked down a multi-block radius. The chaotic shouts of the initial emergency response faded, replaced by the grim, methodical quiet of a major crime scene protocol. Tarps were erected. Media helicopters had already begun circling overhead, their rotors chopping through the dissipating smoke, broadcasting the charred shell of the SUV to a horrified public. Detectives from the homicide squad arrived, walking the perimeter, taking in the proximity of the suspect's lifeless body on the sidewalk. There was no manhunt required. The perpetrator had served as his own executioner, leaving the justice system with nothing but the smoldering wreckage of a fractured family. Forensics teams stepped carefully through the debris field, marking the trajectory of the vehicle, the impact point on the parked car, and the discarded jerry can. The physical evidence perfectly corroborated the dying declaration the victim had just delivered to the first responders. Miles away, inside the back of a speeding ambulance, the fight for survival was deeply clinical and inherently doomed. The rig tore through the morning traffic, its sirens screaming a continuous warning as the driver pushed the heavy vehicle toward the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital. In the rear compartment, paramedics worked with frantic precision to stabilize a physiological collapse. The injuries were beyond the scope of standard trauma medicine. With 97% of her skin destroyed, the body's primary defense mechanism against infection and fluid loss was entirely gone. The medics focused exclusively on airway management and intravenous resuscitation, acutely aware that the thermal damage to her throat would soon cause catastrophic swelling, sealing off her windpipe. Even underneath the heavy, suppressive fog of clinical narcotics, her vital signs presented a terrifying readout of systemic shock. Her blood pressure cratered as her vascular system leaked fluid into the surrounding tissues. The radio transmissions between the ambulance and the emergency room were clipped. Stripped of all standard medical optimism, the receiving physicians were instantly placed on standby for the most extreme classification of burn casualty. She was rushed through the automatic doors of the trauma bay and immediately transferred into the highly regulated, sterile environment of the intensive care unit. Medical personnel swarmed the bed. She was promptly placed into a deep, medically induced coma. This was a necessary intervention designed to shield her brain from the incomprehensible threshold of physical agony and to allow mechanical ventilators to force steady, measured breaths into her compromised lungs. The hospital corridors, typically defined by hushed efficiency and routine, absorbed the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of incoming devastation. Detectives had already made the most difficult phone call in law enforcement to her parents. The drive to the hospital for the family was an agonizing suspension of reality, a claustrophobic limbo bridging the moment they received the news and the visual confirmation waiting for them in the ward. When the family was finally permitted to enter the intensive care unit, the clinical humming of the life support machinery provided a cold, rhythmic soundtrack to their grief. The vibrant, athletic woman who had been the structural foundation of their family was now obscured beneath thick layers of pristine white medical dressing, tethered to a complex array of monitors and plastic tubing. The physicians were candid. The medical reality was completely irreversible. The cellular destruction was too absolute, and multi-organ failure was already cascading through her system. There were no surgical options left, no aggressive therapies that could rebuild what the chemical fire had consumed. The medical staff quietly stepped back, dimming the harsh fluorescent lights, allowing the family the sacred, agonizing space to surround the bed. They stood vigil through the afternoon and into the early evening, speaking softly to her, providing the only comfort left to give. In the quiet glow of the monitors, her heart rate began to slow, steadily dropping as her body finally surrendered the fight. Later that night, the screen flatlined. She passed away, joining her 3 young children in the dark. The moment the time of death was officially recorded, the operational parameters of the police response underwent a stark, definitive shift. The yellow crime scene tape flapping in the evening breeze back at the site of the ambush no longer marked a horrific rescue operation. It now demarcated the epicenter of a quadruple homicide. The focus of the authorities immediately pivoted from emergency containment to retrospective analysis. They needed to understand how a man known to the system, a man with a documented history of severe domestic manipulation, had managed to maneuver himself into a position to execute his family in broad daylight. The physical crime scene was processed with grim efficiency. The forensic mapping of the burned SUV, the chemical analysis of the accelerant, and the autopsy reports provided the concrete mechanics of the massacre. But the actual investigation, the exhaustive retroactive deep dive initiated by homicide detectives, had to answer a far more disturbing question. The perpetrator was not a phantom operating in the shadows. He was a known entity to law enforcement, bound by active protective orders, and thoroughly documented in the domestic violence registry. The true investigation required dissecting exactly how a man radiating such blatant lethal intent was allowed to maneuver seamlessly through the cracks of the justice system. Detectives began pulling the dispatch logs, court filings, and officer notes from the months preceding the ambush. What they uncovered was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The typical investigative hurdles usually involve a lack of evidence or silent witnesses. Here, the primary red herrings were actively manufactured by the assailant himself. He did not evade the police, he weaponized them. Whenever patrol cars responded to domestic disturbances at the marital home, he would meet them at the door with a calm, deferential demeanor. He utilized the same charismatic authority he had perfected as a fitness coach to manage the narrative. He presented himself as an exhausted, heartbroken father who was simply trying to maintain a relationship with his offspring. He effectively flipped the script, framing his estranged wife's genuine terror as an orchestrated campaign of parental alienation. He cried, he expressed deep concern for her mental health, and it worked. The system, built to adjudicate visible, physical altercations, was fundamentally unequipped to diagnose the invisible, suffocating web of coercive control. Responding officers frequently documented the encounters as standard, messy relationship breakdowns, completely missing the predatory nature of his actions. The timeline of escalation laid bare in the police files was chilling. Following the victim's narrow escape in early December, she immediately applied for a domestic violence protective order. The judicial system granted it, establishing legal boundaries that forbade him from coming within a specific radius of her or the children. But a piece of paper only works if the person it binds respects the authority of the court. He respected nothing but his own ego. The first critical failure of the safety net occurred on the morning of December 26th. While the mother was at a local park, the assailant aggressively intercepted them, physically snatching one of the daughters from the sidewalk. He threw the child into his vehicle and sped off, crossing state lines. The panic of that morning was absolute. Frantic calls were made to emergency dispatchers, reporting a kidnapping in progress. Yet the law enforcement response was completely hamstrung by the bureaucratic complexities of family law. Because the separation was recent and final custody parameters had not yet been solidified by a federal judge, the abduction was technically categorized as a civil domestic dispute. It lacked the statutory weight of a stranger kidnapping. Officers were limited in their tactical options. He essentially held the child hostage for days, using her as a bargaining chip to force communication with his estranged wife. When he eventually surrendered the girl, he faced no immediate criminal incarceration for the abduction. The message he internalized was highly dangerous. He could breach the boundaries, terrorize the family, and the system would only offer a bureaucratic slap on the wrist. The investigation revealed that he also engaged in profound legal abuse. He manipulated the family court mediation process, deliberately filing frivolous motions and demanding constant revisions to custody schedules. This was a calculated strategy to drain her remaining financial resources and legally compel her to sit in a room with him. He used the justice system to continue his harassment by proxy. The physical breaches multiplied. The files detailed a relentless campaign of stalking that carefully skirted the edges of serious criminality. He parked his car just outside the legally mandated distance from her parents' home, ensuring she saw him every time she looked out the window. He printed large photographs of her and the children and taped them to the interior windows of his vehicle, transforming his car into a rolling psychological weapon. He also escalated his technological surveillance. Detectives discovered that he had gifted the children a tablet device. Buried deep within the software folders, he had installed an application disguised as a standard family sharing program. It allowed him to secretly track their GPS coordinates in real time and remotely activate the microphone to listen to conversations inside the safe house. When the spyware was discovered and reported, the authorities logged the infraction. He was issued a minor fine and a standard warning. Time and time again, the legal apparatus evaluated these violations as isolated, low-level misdemeanors. They failed to aggregate the data. They did not see the terrifying, overarching pattern of an apex predator who had been deprived of his primary food source, control, and was rapidly running out of non-lethal options to regain it. As the timeline pushed into late January and early February, the financial and social reality of his life began to collapse. The fitness center he had leveraged for status could not function without her administrative labor. The business shuttered. His income evaporated. He was reduced to sleeping in his vehicle or crashing on the couches of remaining acquaintances. To the outside world, he painted a picture of a victimized man ruined by a vindictive spouse. But digital forensics painted an entirely different portrait. A deep dive into the cache of his confiscated laptop and mobile devices revealed a terrifying descent into tactical planning. In the weeks prior to the ambush, his internet search history shifted from fitness routines and legal advice to highly specific, violent queries. He researched the ignition points of various chemical accelerants. He spent hours reading articles about how quickly fire consumes oxygen in enclosed spaces. He looked up the mechanical vulnerabilities of heavy SUV doors. He was not experiencing a spontaneous psychological breakdown. He was meticulously drafting a blueprint for total annihilation. Perhaps the most devastating detail uncovered by the investigative team was the victim's own foresight. She had engaged extensively with domestic violence counselors and support workers. In those confidential sessions, her assessments of the threat were brutally accurate. She explicitly told caseworkers that the protective orders would not stop him. She outlined her absolute certainty that his rigid, narcissistic framework meant he would never accept her independence. The caseworkers noted her chilling premonitions. She believed he was entirely capable of taking her life. But the system demanded physical evidence to justify extreme preventative measures. Without fresh bruises to photograph, without a broken bone to catalog, the threat level remained theoretically low in the eyes of the law. Coercive control is a silent strangulation, and the legal framework was simply not designed to penalize a man for the psychological destruction he inflicted before the fatal blow was struck. The investigation ultimately concluded what she had known for months. The bureaucracy was blind, and she had been entirely on her own. Because the perpetrator chose to bleed out on the pavement, the traditional closure of a criminal trial was impossible. There would be no verdict, no sentencing, no cross-examination of the killer. The official reckoning arrived 2 years later, in March 2022, during a highly anticipated coronial inquest. Over several agonizing days, the court meticulously dissected the timeline of terror. The resulting report delivered a scathing, undeniable truth. The system had failed Hannah and her 3 children. The coroner officially determined that the perpetrator's actions were the catastrophic culmination of extreme coercive control, a psychological subjugation that law enforcement was fundamentally ill-equipped to recognize as a definitive precursor to homicide. The inquest highlighted that the assailant had effectively weaponized the justice system itself, using family court mediations, minor child retrieval disputes, and custody negotiations to maintain his suffocating grip. The final ruling explicitly stated that while responding police officers had technically followed standard operating procedures, those procedures were dangerously outdated. The authorities had been trained to look for physical bruises and broken bones, entirely missing the lethal psychological strangulation that had been tightening around the family for nearly a decade. The coroner's report became a profound, permanent indictment of a bureaucratic safety net that essentially required victims to sustain physical trauma before it would offer any tangible protection. The ashes on that suburban street eventually washed away, but the shockwave permanently altered the legal landscape. Driven by the unrelenting advocacy of her parents, sweeping legislative reforms were introduced, officially criminalizing the invisible chains of coercive control. It was a monumental victory, paid for with an unbearable price. She did not fade quietly in the shadows. She spent her final conscious moments ensuring her truth was carved into the official record, a final, unbreakable act of defiance. Her legacy is no longer defined by the man who tried to erase her, but by the systemic revolution her courage ignited. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. An active-duty New York police officer is sworn to protect the vulnerable. But on a bitter January morning, with outside temperatures plunging to 19 degrees Fahrenheit, one officer was actively monitoring a child's agonizing decline. The boy was just 8 years old. He wasn't a casualty of the streets. He was locked on the freezing concrete floor of an unheated suburban garage. And the man watching him die through the lens of a security camera was his own father. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. To the outside world, Michael Valva was the embodiment of order and public service. He joined the New York City Police Department in 2005, working his way up to a transit officer navigating the chaotic subterranean arteries of the city. Earning a comfortable six-figure salary, he presented the polished, irreproachable facade of an authority figure. He was the man citizens looked to for safety. Behind the uniform, his personal life was a decaying structure. Michael had married Justyna Zubko, a Polish immigrant who dreamed of building a stable family in America. Together, they had 3 sons, Anthony, Thomas, and Andrew. The middle child, Thomas, was born in 2011 with a bright, infectious smile that masked underlying developmental challenges. Both Thomas and his older brother, Anthony, were eventually diagnosed with severe autism. They were largely nonverbal in their early years, struggling with sensory overload and requiring intense, structured therapies just to navigate a standard day. Raising children on the spectrum demands immense patience, a virtue Michael entirely lacked. His approach to parenting mirrored a militaristic chain of command. When the boys failed to comply with his rigid expectations, his frustration manifested in cold, authoritarian discipline. The strain of managing complex developmental needs eroded the foundation of the marriage. By 2015, Justyna and Michael were locked in a vicious, highly toxic divorce. What followed was a protracted, agonizing custody battle that highlighted a catastrophic flaw in the family court system. Michael understood how to manipulate the legal machinery. He weaponized his badge, presenting himself to judges and child welfare evaluators as a stoic, responsible law enforcement officer rescuing his sons from an allegedly unstable mother. He filed relentless petitions, burying Justyna in legal paperwork and baseless accusations. He painted her as neglectful and erratic, utilizing his polished courtroom demeanor to slowly strip away her maternal rights. The system took his word over hers. In late 2017, a judge made a ruling that sealed the boy's fate, granting Michael full custody and severely restricting Justyna's visitation to supervised, fleeting moments. She was devastated, effectively erased from her children's daily lives, despite her frantic warnings to anyone who would listen that her ex-husband was a dangerous man. Armed with absolute legal control, Michael relocated his sons to a quiet, middle-class neighborhood in Center Mauritius, a hamlet on the south shore of Long Island. The house at 11 Bittersweet Lane looked like an idyllic suburban retreat. It had a manicured lawn, an attached 2-car garage, and ample space for a growing family. It was exactly the kind of setting that deflects suspicion. For a brief period, the narrative Michael sold to his neighbors held up. He was the dedicated single father and decorated cop, sacrificing everything to raise 3 boys, 2 of whom had special needs. He was applauded, he was respected, but the architecture of this suburban dream was hollow. Michael had zero intention of managing the heavy burden of autism with empathy or therapeutic intervention. He viewed his son's neurological differences not as a medical reality to be managed, but as deliberate defiance that needed to be punished out of them. The Long Island home quickly transitioned from a sanctuary into a heavily surveilled detention center. Every room was wired with an intricate network of security cameras. Michael claimed the surveillance was for the boys' safety, a necessary precaution to monitor children prone to wandering. The truth was far more sinister. The cameras were installed to monitor absolute obedience. If Anthony or Thomas exhibited a sensory meltdown, failed to use the bathroom correctly, or simply cried out, the lenses recorded their infractions. The boys were entirely isolated from their mother and left at the mercy of a man who equated discipline with sheer terror. Yet even with his authoritarian grip, Michael soon realized he did not want to rule this dark kingdom alone. He was looking for a partner, someone who shared his chilling philosophy on control and punishment. The arrival of Angela Pollina into the Valva residence in early 2018 acted as a catalyst for a regime of systematic terror. Angela, a single mother of 3, brought her own children into the home, creating a crowded, combustible dynamic. She was not a moderating influence. She was the architect of the household's new draconian hierarchy. Together, she and Michael forged a partnership defined by the absolute dehumanization of his 3 sons. The house on Bittersweet Lane ceased to be a home. It became an institution of psychological warfare. Under Angela's influence, the boys' needs for therapy, speech assistance, and even standard interaction were deemed disruptive. She perceived their neurodivergence not as a challenge, but as an affront to her order. The response was the implementation of a training regimen that bypassed standard discipline, veering sharply into what investigators would later describe as localized torture. The boys were stripped of their autonomy. They were forced to eat their meals in the garage, a cold, detached space that smelled of exhaust and damp concrete. They were placed on restricted, starvation-level diets under the guise of weight management, despite their clear physical deterioration. If they failed to follow the house rules that changed with the volatility of Angela's moods, the consequences were immediate and severe. For the smallest transgressions, they were denied access to the main living area. They were forced to sleep on the hard, unheated floor of the garage, regardless of the season or the plummeting Long Island temperatures. The boys began to lose weight rapidly. Their faces became gaunt, their skin sallow. They were often seen by neighbors and teachers wearing stained, ill-fitting clothes, their personal hygiene clearly neglected, despite Michael's constant claims that he was providing exemplary care. Teachers at East Mauritius Elementary School noticed the erosion of the boys' well-being almost immediately. Thomas, once a vibrant child, began arriving at school lethargic, cold to the touch, and frequently bruised. His performance plummeted. He struggled to stay awake during lessons. The school staff, alarmed by the drastic changes, initiated a flood of reports to Child Protective Services. The institutional response was a profound systemic failure. Between 2018 and 2020, CPS received at least a dozen reports concerning the Valva home. Teachers documented that the boys were arriving at school hungry, begging for food, and shivering in the classrooms. They reported visible welts, suspicious abrasions, and a pervasive, lingering odor of urine. Every report triggered an investigation, but every investigation was met with Michael's polished, authoritative denial. He played the system with the precision of a seasoned detective. When CPS agents arrived, he would present a carefully curated image of a stressed but loving father doing his best with children who were difficult to manage due to their autism. He used his NYPD background to intimidate investigators, implying that he knew the rules of the game better than they did. Angela stood by his side, doubling down on the narrative that the children were simply prone to behavioral outbursts and physical self-harm. The system was paralyzed by his badge. CPS agents documented their concerns, but their supervisors repeatedly closed the cases as unfounded, seemingly intimidated by the idea of accusing a fellow law enforcement officer of child abuse. The boys were trapped. Every time a teacher reached out, Michael punished the children for the attention they had brought upon the family. The monitoring became tighter. The beatings grew more frequent. The couple began to communicate their frustrations through a series of cold, detached text messages that would later serve as the primary evidence of their shared malice. They discussed the boys with a detached clinical cruelty, referring to them as nuisances or burdens. Angela would send messages complaining that Thomas had wet himself or that Anthony had failed to follow a command, and Michael would respond with promises of intensified discipline. They were not two parents struggling with the realities of raising special needs children. They were two people bonding over the systematic breaking of their spirits. By the winter of 2020, the garage had become a permanent, frigid prison. It was no longer a temporary space for a timeout. It was where Thomas and Anthony spent their nights, shivering on the bare floor, separated from the warmth of the home by a single wall. The boys had no blankets, no pillows, and no access to a toilet. They were forced to exist in a state of constant, low-grade hypothermia. Michael and Angela monitored them through the Nest camera, occasionally broadcasting instructions through the speaker if the boys moved or made a sound. The stage was set for a tragedy that the entire community would later realize was entirely preventable, had anyone bothered to look past the badge and see the suffering that was happening in plain sight. The night of January 16th bled into the early hours of the 17th with a biting, unforgiving edge. Outside the property on Bittersweet Lane, the temperature plummeted to 19 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the unheated, attached garage, it was barely any warmer. The concrete floor acted as a massive heat sink, draining whatever residual warmth remained in the stagnant air. There was no insulation, no drywall, just the raw, abrasive surface of the cement and a few scattered dog training pads. The only bedding provided for two severely malnourished boys. Hypothermia does not announce itself with a sudden crash. It is a slow, methodical thief. It steals heat from the extremities first, forcing the heart to pump sluggishly, hoarding blood in the core to protect the vital organs. The boys had been subjected to these sub-freezing conditions for months, their bodies already depleted from extreme caloric restriction. But this particular morning was different. The cold was absolute. It bypassed their meager, exhausted defense mechanisms entirely. Sometime before dawn, Thomas lost control of his bodily functions. It was an inevitable biological response to severe, prolonged freezing and extreme stress, compounded by his neurological condition. He soiled his sweatpants. In a normal household, this would prompt a warm bath and clean clothes. In this environment, it was an unforgivable infraction. The home's security system silently logged the movement. The internal microphones flickered to life, capturing the rustling in the dark, followed by the heavy, deliberate footsteps of a man who had just been inconvenienced. Michael entered the garage. The audio recordings later extracted from the hard drive would capture the sheer, unfiltered malice of his approach. He did not assess the situation with a shred of paternal concern. He demanded absolute compliance from a child whose brain was actively shutting down from the cold. Michael noted the soiled clothing. The punishment was decided instantly, and it was going to be administered with freezing water. He dragged the boy outside into the frozen backyard. The sun had not fully risen. The frost on the grass crunched underfoot. Michael bypassed the indoor bathrooms, heading straight for the exterior spigot connected to a garden hose. The water resting in those pipes was near freezing. He turned the valve. He ordered his son to strip naked, then sprayed the ice-cold water directly onto his bare, emaciated chest. The shock of freezing water on a hypothermic body accelerates the dying process exponentially. The cold liquid strips away the skin's last remaining thermal barrier, plunging the core temperature into a lethal freefall. The boy's muscles seized. His nervous system misfired. He could no longer shiver to generate friction and heat. The body was rapidly prioritizing the brain and the heart, completely shutting off blood flow to the limbs. He could barely stand. Michael dragged him back into the garage. The interior Nest camera recorded the aftermath. The footage showed a child who looked more like a hollow shell than a human being. He was completely naked, dripping wet, and shaking with a violent, terrifying lack of coordination. He attempted to stand on the concrete, but his legs simply buckled. He pitched forward, face planting onto the hard cement. The sickening sound of bone-meeting stone echoed sharply through the microphone. There was no gasp of horror from the adults, no frantic rush to check for a concussion. Michael simply stood over him, The audio captured the father coldly analyzing the fall, remarking over the intercom system that the boy was putting on an act. He noted the way his son hit the ground, expressing a twisted satisfaction that the child had finally fallen on his face. Angela, monitoring from the warmth of another room, validated the cruelty. She communicated through the speaker, noting that the child was looking at them and insisted he be made to clean himself up. They spoke about the boy with the detached annoyance of prison guards dealing with a recalcitrant inmate. They left him there on the floor. The boy tried to push himself up, his arms trembling violently, but he lacked the basic motor function to lock his elbows. He collapsed again. The temperature in the garage remained stagnant. His core temperature was dropping past the point of no return, crossing rapidly from mild to moderate to severe hypothermia. At this stage of freezing, the biology of death takes over. The organs begin to fail sequentially. The kidneys stop filtering. The heart struggles to maintain a regular rhythm, the blood thickening into a cold sludge. Time crawled. The camera continued its silent, indifferent observation. It captured the exact, horrific moment the shivering stopped. When a freezing body stops shivering, it is not a sign of warming or comfort. It is the central nervous system waving a white flag. The muscles relax. The breathing becomes shallow, barely moving the chest wall. The brain runs out of oxygenated blood. Minutes ticked by in heavy silence. The stillness in the garage finally caught Michael's attention. The boy wasn't crying. He wasn't moving. The father walked back in, his boots scuffing the concrete. He nudged the limp form. Nothing. He issued a sharp command. Silence. The frustration in his movements suddenly gave way to a sharp, entirely selfish panic. It was not the terror of a parent realizing they are losing their child. It was the massive adrenaline spike of a police officer realizing he had a dead body on his property. He scooped up the freezing, unresponsive form and finally brought him into the heated portion of the house. He dragged him down to the basement playroom. Michael shouted to Angela that the boy was out cold. The atmosphere in the house shifted violently from punishment to extreme liability. Instead of calling emergency services immediately, precious time was systematically squandered. The security network captured the frantic, hushed discussions between the couple about what to do next. They needed to clean him. They needed to warm him up just enough to make a narrative plausible. They needed a solid, impenetrable story, a slip and fall, a tragic, unavoidable accident while waiting for the school bus. While an 8-year-old boy lay dying on the basement floor, his father began constructing an alibi. The window of survivability closed while the adults in the house prioritized their alibi. Medical experts would later note that when the boy was first carried up from the freezing garage, his heart was likely still beating, faintly, erratically, but beating. A warm bath, thermal blankets, and an immediate emergency response might have reversed the descent into terminal hypothermia. Instead, nearly an hour evaporated. During those critical minutes, the homeowner focused on sanitizing the crime scene and coordinating a cover story. Only after the narrative was set and the child's pulse had completely faded did he pick up the phone. At exactly 9:40 a.m., the Suffolk County Emergency Dispatch System logged the incoming call. The voice on the line belonged to a man intimately familiar with how 911 operates from the other side of the radio. He injected a carefully measured dose of panic into his tone, telling the operator that his son had taken a hard spill on the driveway while running for the school bus. He claimed the boy had hit his head, lost consciousness, and was no longer breathing. Following standard protocol, the dispatcher instructed the caller to place the phone on speaker and begin chest compressions. The audio recording captured the rhythmic, heavy thuds of the father ostensibly performing CPR, a performative, hollow effort executed on a body that had already been irreparably destroyed by the cold. When local paramedics and patrol officers crossed the threshold of the Bittersweet Lane residence, they stepped into a heavily heated, immaculate home. The contrast between the ambient temperature of the living room and the physical state of the patient was immediately jarring. First responders found the father in the basement playroom, kneeling beside his son. He was going through the motions of resuscitation, but his demeanor lacked the chaotic, blind desperation typical of a parent losing a child. He was entirely too composed, casually informing the arriving officers that he was in on YPD, subtly attempting to establish professional courtesy and control the flow of information right from the start. The lead paramedic dropped beside the boy and placed a hand on his bare chest to place the defibrillator pads. The EMT physically recoiled. The child's skin was not just cool to the touch, it was a dense, unnatural block of ice. The limbs were stiff, locking into place with a rigidity that usually takes hours of post-mortem lividity to achieve. There was no obvious laceration, no skull depression, and no localized pooling of blood to corroborate a catastrophic fall on a concrete driveway. Nothing about the physical trauma matched the father's story. The paramedic initiated rapid transport protocols. They loaded the lifeless form onto a stretcher and rushed him to the waiting ambulance. The ride to Long Island Community Hospital was a frantic, chaotic exercise in futility. The EMTs attempted to push life-saving medications, but the veins were completely collapsed. They tried to establish a secure airway, but the jaw muscles were locked tight from the extreme physiological shock. The interior of the ambulance was cranked to maximum heat, yet the boy's flesh simply absorbed the warmth without reflecting any vital signs. Through it all, the medical team exchanged troubled glances. They knew the physiological signs of freezing. They knew they were not treating a head injury. Inside the hospital's trauma bay, a specialized pediatric resuscitation team took over. They immediately initiated severe hypothermia protocols. Medical doctrine dictates that a freezing victim is not clinically dead until they are warm and dead. The doctors ordered bear hugger warming blankets, heated intravenous saline, and continuous automated chest compressions. The room hummed with the mechanical whine of ventilators and the flat, sustained tone of the heart monitor. Amidst the chaos of the trauma bay, the attending physician needed to establish a baseline. A standard digital thermometer registered nothing. The patient's temperature was too low to read. The staff inserted a specialized esophageal thermometer deep into the chest cavity to measure the absolute core temperature around the heart and lungs. When the digital display finally flashed, the trauma team fell completely silent. The monitor read 76.1 degrees Fahrenheit. Normal human core temperature is 98.6. At 90 degrees, severe confusion and amnesia set in. At 82 degrees, the heart loses its ability to pump effectively, and the victim loses consciousness. At 76.1 degrees, the cellular structure simply ceases to function. It was a temperature that was biologically impossible to reach from a brief slip on a suburban driveway. It was a number that indicated prolonged, agonizing exposure to a sub-freezing environment. The medical staff continued their warming efforts for nearly an hour, adhering strictly to protocol, but the damage to the myocardium was absolute. There was no electrical activity left to restart. The formal pronouncement of death was recorded later that morning. Out in the hospital waiting room, the father continued his performance. He paced the floor, shed dry tears for the benefit of the hospital staff, and repeatedly leaned on his law enforcement credentials when questioned by the attending nurses. He expected his badge to shield him from scrutiny. He assumed the medical examiner would glance at the lack of massive blunt force trauma, write it off as an unexplained sudden cardiac event, and close the file. But the trauma doctors had already noted the gaunt, emaciated frame, the strange abrasions, and that impossible, damning core temperature. Before the father even left the hospital grounds, the attending physician picked up a secure phone and initiated a direct line to Suffolk County homicide detectives. The medical intervention had failed, but the investigation was just beginning, and the driveway narrative was already falling apart. The transition from a medical emergency to a homicide investigation occurred before the victim's body was even transferred to the county morgue. Suffolk County detectives were dispatched to the hospital and the Bittersweet Lane residence simultaneously. They held the core temperature reading from the trauma bay, a stark, numerical fact that completely dismantled the suspect's story of a sudden morning tumble. A human body simply does not lose 22 degrees of vital core heat during a brief, frantic sprint to a school bus. When investigators arrived at the property, they were met by a man who fully expected professional deference. He stood in his living room, projecting the exhausted stoicism of a grieving parent, while subtly inserting his NYPD rank into the conversation. He anticipated the unspoken fraternity of law enforcement to shield him from aggressive interrogation. The initial walkthrough of the home presented a frustrating, meticulously sanitized facade. The main living areas were immaculate, smelling faintly of citrus cleaner. Outside, the driveway where the fatal injury supposedly occurred was entirely clear. Crime scene technicians noted a complete absence of blood, ice patches, or any physical irregularity that could support a catastrophic blunt force trauma. The detectives faced an immediate, infuriating wall. Without a confession or an independent witness, they possessed a deceased child with a bizarre thermal presentation, but a highly experienced suspect who knew exactly how the interrogation game was played. When detectives pressed for specific minute-by-minute timelines regarding the morning routine, the father recognized the shifting, accusatory tone. Relying on his academy training, he abruptly terminated the conversation and invoked his right to counsel. The house fell silent. The investigators were forced to step back, secure the perimeter, and wait for a judge to sign search warrants. The breakthrough did not originate from human testimony. It came from the ceiling corners. During their initial visual sweep, technicians noted an extensive, highly sophisticated network of Wise and Nest surveillance cameras mounted both inside and outside the property. The homeowner had claimed the interior lenses were inactive, simply dead remnants of a past security setup. Homicide detectives, however, operate on the premise that digital hardware never truly forgets. They drafted comprehensive warrants targeting not just the physical local routers in the house, but the external cloud servers hosted by the tech companies. While waiting for the cyber extraction, forensics teams dismantled the physical crime scene. They focused their lenses intensely on the attached garage. The space stood in stark, chilling contrast to the pristine house. It was heavily drafted and, underneath a thick, fresh layer of industrial bleach, retained the distinct, acrid odor of dried urine. Investigators cataloged soiled dog training pads pushed into a dark corner. There were no beds, no thermal blankets, just rough concrete and a few discarded, undersized items of children's clothing. Technicians took ambient temperature readings of the floor, documenting the brutal thermal reality of the space. The invisible architecture of the boy's existence was finally materializing. 72 hours later, the cybercrimes unit successfully pulled a massive cache of data from the external cloud servers. The suspect had actively attempted to delete the files from his phone on the morning of the incident, confident that wiping his application history would erase his sins. He had vastly underestimated the automatic backup redundancy of modern security systems. What the detectives witnessed in the viewing room of the precinct was a concentrated, unfiltered dose of human depravity. Seasoned investigators, personnel who had spent decades dissecting violent gang murders and fatal accidents, sat in heavy silence as the mid-January footage played across their monitors. The restored digital files provided an unflinching timeline. They watched the 8-year-old shivering uncontrollably on the concrete. They processed the audio tracks, hearing the sharp blast of the exterior water spigot and the subsequent sickening sound of the boy collapsing face first onto the cement. The audio was pristine. It captured the father's cruel mockery of his son's physical inability to stand, followed by the stepmother's voice transmitting over the intercom system. She validated the abuse, expressing sheer annoyance at the child's lack of coordination rather than any alarm for his safety. The digital media explicitly contradicted every single statement given to the emergency dispatcher and the arriving paramedics. There was no chaotic fall in the driveway. There was no tragic accident. There was only a calculated, protracted execution by exposure. Armed with the video evidence, technicians escalated their digital search, applying Cellebrite extraction software to the cellular devices seized from the residents. The text message history between the couple spanned years and served as the psychological blueprint of the household. The data dump yielded tens of thousands of messages. They did not read like the communications of overwhelmed parents navigating the complexities of autism. They read like the cold logistics of a penal colony. The SMS threads detailed a highly coordinated strategy of thermal deprivation and starvation. The stepmother frequently complained about the boy's mere presence in the main house, demanding they be banished to the garage. The father eagerly complied, assuring her through text that the children would be beaten until they learned absolute obedience. They discussed restricting access to the kitchen, locking the pantry doors, and utilizing the freezing dark as a standard disciplinary measure. The digital trail proved conclusively that the fatal morning was not an isolated lapse in judgment. It was the terminal end of a systematic torture regimen that both adults actively curated. The facade of the respectable suburban police officer was thoroughly incinerated. The local department, initially cautious about investigating one of their own, moved with overwhelming force. The evidence was insurmountable. Exactly 1 week after the child was pronounced dead in the trauma bay, unmarked police vehicles surrounded the Bittersweet Lane home. Detectives moved in with tactical precision, securing the premises and placing both the father and the stepmother in handcuffs. They were transported to the precinct, stripped of their belts and shoelaces, and booked on charges of second-degree murder and child endangerment. The arrests sent a violent shockwave through the Center Mauritius community. Neighbors who had previously praised the father's supposed dedication were left grappling with a profound, sickening sense of horror. The realization that a child had slowly frozen to death behind the closed doors of a seemingly perfect middle-class home shattered the neighborhood's illusion of safety. The thin blue line narrative collapsed entirely as the public demanded answers, furious at the institutional blindness that had ignored years of frantic warnings from local educators. The investigation had successfully pulled back the curtain on a domestic nightmare, but the hardest phase of the process was just looming on the horizon. The wheels of justice grind slowly, and it took nearly 3 years for the legal reckoning to fully materialize in Suffolk County. By the fall of 2022, the former transit cop found himself sitting at the defense table, entirely stripped of his uniform, his pension, and his authority. The united defensive front he had maintained with his fiancée had completely collapsed under the weight of impending prison time. What unfolded was a vicious, calculated game of self-preservation. His defense attorneys deployed a desperate strategy. They attempted to paint their client as an overwhelmed, passive figure, a man entirely dominated by a manipulative partner who masterminded the draconian punishments. They argued that the fatal morning was a tragic culmination of bad parenting and sheer panic, not depraved indifference to human life. They insisted he never intended to kill. The prosecution did not bother arguing semantics. They dimmed the courtroom lights and let the digital hardware speak. When the state played the recovered security footage, the atmosphere in the room turned suffocatingly heavy. Jurors were forced to listen to the final agonizing minutes of a child freezing to death on a concrete floor. They heard the sickening thud of the fall. They heard the callous, mocking commentary from the adults. Several jurors wept openly. Others simply stared at the defendant with unmasked revulsion. The biological mother, who had been systematically alienated and ignored for years, sat in the gallery. She was forced to absorb the graphic, clinical details of her son's demise, from the initial EMT reports detailing his icy skin to the medical examiner's rigid breakdown of terminal hypothermia. The teachers who had filed dozens of ignored reports took the stand, their voices thick with the grief of knowing their alarms had rung hollow. The evidence formed an impenetrable wall. In early November 2022, the jury reached a swift, unanimous decision. They found him guilty of murder in the second degree and multiple counts of endangering the welfare of a child. Weeks later, the presiding judge handed down the absolute maximum penalty allowed, 25 years to life behind bars. The stepmother's turn came in early 2023. Her legal team attempted the exact inverse of her former partner's narrative. They tried to frame her as a terrified, battered woman held hostage by an aggressive, highly trained police officer. They claimed she was a powerless bystander in her own home, too afraid of his explosive temper to intervene and save the boys. Her own digital footprint decimated that defense. Prosecutors projected her text messages onto the courtroom screens. The jury read the cold, logistical demands she made to banish the children from the heated living spaces. They listened to her disembodied voice coming through the garage intercom, berating a child whose core temperature was in freefall. She was not a victim of circumstance. The state proved she was the architect of the environment that made the murder possible. Her jury deliberated for barely 2 hours. The verdict mirrored her ex-fiancé's exactly. Shortly after, she stood before the same judge and received the identical sentence of 25 years to life in a maximum security penitentiary. The gavels fell, locking the perpetrators away for the remainder of their natural lives. However, the closing of the criminal dockets did not bring true closure. It merely shifted the spotlight to the massive institutional failures that had allowed a documented domestic prison to operate in plain sight. The tragedy in Center Mauritius permanently fractured the quiet facade of Long Island suburbia. It proved that predators do not always lurk in the dark. Sometimes they wear a patrol badge and wave from a manicured lawn. A child froze on a concrete floor because an entire protective system was too intimidated to look past a uniform. Dozens of frantic alarms rang for years, only to be silenced by bureaucratic apathy. Retribution was eventually served, but it arrived far too late to offer any real warmth. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. A young mother is bludgeoned to death in her own living room. The weapon is a baseball bat. The floorboards are soaked. Just a few feet away, her 1-year-old daughter sits quietly in a playpen, completely unharmed. Hours later, the man who swung the bat sits down for a traditional Thanksgiving dinner. He passes the turkey. He bounces the toddler on his knee. Outside, sitting in the freezing November air, is a heavy black plastic tote containing the child's mother. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Woodland Park, Colorado, sits at an elevation of nearly 8,500 feet. It is a place where the air is thin, the winters are unforgiving, and privacy is merely an illusion. This is the kind of tight-knit mountain enclave where a muddy pickup truck parked in the wrong driveway becomes local gossip before noon. People move to Teller County for the isolation, or to escape the noise of the city. The towering pines and snow-capped peaks offer a picture-perfect facade of serenity. Kelsey Barrett didn't come here to hide. At 29, she arrived in the Rocky Mountains, chasing altitude and opportunity. She worked as an aviation instructor, a woman who spent her days navigating complex airspace and her evenings grounded in the quiet routines of rural life. Born and raised in Washington State, with deep family roots anchored in Idaho, Kelsey possessed a fierce, quiet independence. She wasn't one to rely on anyone else to fix her problems. Her mother, Cheryl, knew her as driven, a woman who knew exactly how to chart her own course and follow it through. Kelsey's daily life was defined by precision. Her world smelled of aviation fuel, crisp high-altitude ozone, and the stale coffee of the flight dispatch room. She commanded respect in a notoriously male-dominated field, teaching students how to recover from mid-air stalls and navigate severe turbulence. She was meticulous, highly organized, and fundamentally practical. A pilot has to be. Every pre-flight check, every calculated risk was measured to ensure a safe landing. She approached her personal life with the same methodical care. She wanted a family, a stable home, and a quiet space to build a future. But human nature is vastly more unpredictable than aerodynamics. You can't always see a storm gathering on the radar. The rugged landscape of the surrounding county produced men who prided themselves on extreme self-reliance. Patrick Frazee fit this archetype flawlessly. At 32, he operated as a local farrier and cattle rancher. He spent his days shoeing horses, mending barbed wire fences, and maintaining a stoic cowboy persona that played perfectly with the local demographic. Patrick's world smelled of burning keratin, manure, and heavy diesel. He wore the grease on his hands and the dust on his boots like a badge of honor. To the casual observer, he was a hard-working, traditional man, a quiet pillar of rural masculinity. He rarely spoke more than necessary, a trait the townspeople easily mistook for quiet strength. Underneath that carefully curated, rustic exterior, the reality was cold and hollow. Frazee still lived with his mother on a sprawling, secluded 35-acre ranch in Florissant, just 15 miles west of Woodland Park. Despite the open spaces surrounding him, his mindset was rigidly confined. He demanded absolute control over his environment. The horses he broke, the iron he hammered into submission, the people he allowed into his limited orbit. Everything had to yield to his specific will. Where Kelsey was open, optimistic, and ambitious, Patrick was deeply insular. He viewed the world through a strictly transactional lens. People were tools to be utilized. Relationships were not equal partnerships. They were territorial acquisitions. He possessed a terrifying capability to compartmentalize his emotions, burying a calculating, predatory nature beneath a wide-brimmed hat and a polite nod. When you place a woman who thrives on freedom and elevation next to a man obsessed with absolute ownership and control, the resulting friction is inevitable. Kelsey looked at the expansive Colorado sky and saw endless possibilities. Patrick looked at his acreage and saw borders he needed to fiercely enforce. They existed in completely different realities, sharing only geographic proximity and the thin mountain air. It was a fatal collision course masked by the mundane rhythms of country living. The aviation instructor and the farrier, one always looking up, the other focused entirely on the dirt. The initial connection did not happen at a local rodeo or a dusty feed store. It started through the sterile, artificial glow of a computer screen. In the spring of 2016, an online dating platform bridged the gap between the ambitious pilot and the reserved rancher. Digital profiles are carefully curated, designed to showcase only the most appealing angles of a life while hiding the shadows. Through text messages and brief phone calls, Patrick presented himself as a hard-working, traditional family man looking to settle down. Kelsey saw a grounded partner. She saw someone who valued sweat equity and the quiet beauty of the mountains. Drawn by the promise of a shared future, she made a massive concession. She packed up her life in Washington state, leaving behind an established support network, and moved to Teller County just to be closer to him. It was a significant leap of faith. She secured a job in Pueblo, managing a grueling commute that often stretched for hours down winding, icy highways, simply to make the geography work. But physical proximity quickly revealed the deep, jagged fractures in their compatibility. The charming cowboy she met online dissolved into an exacting, critical authoritarian. Patrick expected a woman who would fold neatly into his rigid schedule, a silent background character on his 35-acre property. Instead, he got an independent professional who earned her own paycheck, possessed her own opinions, and refused to be entirely subservient. The friction was immediate and constant. Within months of her relocation, the dynamic shifted from romantic to heavily transactional. Then came the news that permanently altered the trajectory of both their lives: an unplanned pregnancy. For Kelsey, the child was a profound blessing, a reason to double down on building a cohesive, loving family. She began nesting, buying baby gear, and envisioning a life shared under one roof. For Patrick, a baby represented a tether, an obligation that fundamentally threatened his absolute autonomy. When their daughter was born late the following year, the couple's living situation remained profoundly abnormal. Engaged but never married, they still did not share a home. The mother and newborn lived in a modest townhouse in Woodland Park. The father remained 15 miles away in Florissant, living with his own mother. He dictated the terms of this separation. He claimed his property was no place for an infant, citing the physical dangers of livestock, heavy machinery, and exposure to the extreme elements. In reality, it was a barricade. The distance allowed him to retain total control over his domain while accessing his child and his fiancée, only when it suited his schedule. Kelsey navigated the exhausting, bone-deep fatigue of single motherhood while technically wearing an engagement ring. She paid her own rent. She bought the groceries. She maintained her demanding career as an instructor, grading flight logs while the baby slept. All the while, she waited for the man she loved to step up, to finally integrate their lives. He kept her suspended in a perpetual state of emotional purgatory, offering just enough sparse affection to keep her anchored, but never enough commitment to provide genuine security. The isolation of her townhouse slowly became a psychological cage. While he kept his fiancée at arm's length, Patrick was quietly cultivating a completely separate, parallel existence. 600 miles northwest, in the high desert of Twin Falls, Idaho, lived a woman who had known him for over a decade. Crystal Lee Kenny was a divorced nurse, a mother of two, and someone who harbored a long-standing pathetic infatuation with the Colorado cowboy. Their history was a messy, unresolved tangle of brief romantic encounters and lingering emotional dependency. He knew her pressure points. He knew exactly how to exploit her deep-seated insecurities. He did not just call the Idaho nurse to catch up. He groomed her. He began weaving a dark, elaborate fiction, systematically destroying the character of his fiancée from afar. Through late-night phone calls and encrypted burner phones, he painted himself as a desperate, trapped victim. He fabricated horrific stories, claiming the mother of his child was an abusive, neglectful alcoholic who was actively, physically endangering their infant daughter. He described fictional incidents of abuse with chilling conviction. He played directly on the nurse's maternal instincts and her desperate, hollow need for his validation. The nurse swallowed the lies completely. She wanted to be his savior. She wanted to prove her ultimate loyalty, hoping that by rescuing him, she would finally win his love. The manipulation was a masterclass in coercive control. Patrick recognized that he could weaponize Crystal's blind devotion. Once he firmly established the false narrative of the unstable, dangerous fiancé, the tenor of the conversations shifted. He stopped complaining about his domestic situation and started brainstorming permanent solutions. The rhetoric turned lethal. He casually introduced the idea that the only way to protect his daughter was to eliminate the threat entirely. He asked the nurse to help him permanently resolve the issue. It wasn't a sudden, impassioned snap of rage. It was a cold, methodical brainwashing process designed to turn an insecure, middle-aged healthcare worker into a willing accomplice to a homicide. His obsession with absolute control had mutated into something monstrous. He didn't just want to avoid a messy, public custody battle or the financial burden of monthly child support. He wanted to erase the aviation instructor from the earth. He wanted the child. He wanted his unchecked freedom, and he wanted a clean slate, achieved through calculated violence. As the leaves in Teller County turned to brittle gold and the overnight temperatures began to plummet in the late fall of 2018, the trap was already fully set. Kelsey continued to decorate her townhouse, buying winter clothes for her toddler and planning a warm Thanksgiving dinner, entirely unaware that the man she planned to marry was actively crowdsourcing her execution. The digital timestamp on the surveillance video registers the mid-morning hours. The local Safeway grocery store is awash in the harsh, artificial glare of fluorescent lighting. Shoppers navigate the crowded aisles, rushing to purchase last-minute items for their holiday meals. Among them is a mother, dressed casually in a white sweater and a light scarf. She pushes a metal shopping cart. Nestled securely in the front basket is a baby carrier holding her 1-year-old daughter. The security cameras track her movements from the produce section to the checkout lanes. She buys sweet potatoes, recipe ingredients, and a few essentials. It is a completely ordinary, unremarkable holiday morning. She pays for her items, gathers her child, and walks out through the automatic sliding glass doors into the crisp, high-altitude autumn air. These grainy, silent security images mark the final public documentation of her life. She loads the groceries into her vehicle and drives back to her townhouse, preparing to host the man she still hopes to marry. Early that afternoon, a heavy pickup truck pulls into the driveway of the modest complex. The farrier steps out. He does not carry flowers. He does not carry a gift. He carries a dark, rigid agenda that has been weeks in the making. He walks through the front door. The townhouse is warm. The air is thick with the scent of baking and domestic routine. The baby is placed safely in a playpen in the center of the living room, surrounded by brightly colored plastic toys. The atmosphere between the couple is deceptively calm. There is no argument. There are no raised voices. There is no violent domestic disturbance to alert the neighbors sharing the thin adjoining walls. He relies on a terrifyingly flat, even demeanor. He needs the environment controlled. He needs his target compliant, relaxed, and positioned precisely where he wants her. He introduces a distraction. He suggests a game. He tells her he brought several different scented candles and wants her to guess the specific fragrances. It is a juvenile, slightly odd suggestion, but it is deeply disarming. It strips away any lingering tension. He instructs her to sit down on the living room floor. He produces a heavy sweater and ties it securely around her eyes, fashioning a tight, impenetrable blindfold. She sits directly on the hardwood floor, completely stripped of her primary sense. She is plunged into artificial darkness, anticipating the smell of vanilla, cinnamon, or pine. She trusts the father of her child enough to sit defenseless in her own home. She waits in the quiet room for the game to begin. The pacing of the room shatters. He does not reach for a candle. He reaches for a heavy, solid wood baseball bat. He positions himself directly behind her. The baby babbles in the playpen, situated a mere 3 feet away. He raises the heavy wood. He grips the handle. He swings. The first strike is devastating. The hollow, sickening thud of dense wood meeting bone fractures the quiet afternoon. She falls instantly. She doesn't have time to remove the sweater from her eyes. She does not have the capacity to scream. She does not have the chance to fight back or reach for her child. He steps forward. He swings again and again. The violence is kinetic, overwhelming, and absolute. The force of the repeated blows shatters her skull. The metallic, heavy tang of arterial blood instantly overpowers the smell of the holiday meal, cooking in the adjacent kitchen. It sprays in violent arcs across the beige walls. It coats the television screen. It pools heavily on the hardwood floor. Microscopic droplets mist over the baby's playpen, settling onto the plastic toys and the child's clothing. He does not stop until all movement ceases. He does not stop until the structural integrity of the human body beneath him is completely destroyed. Silence crashes back into the cramped living room. It is interrupted only by the heavy, ragged breathing of the killer, and the oblivious, soft sounds of a toddler playing just inches from the expanding pool of her mother's blood. He stands over the ruin he created. He is entirely pragmatic. There is no panic. There is no frantic pacing or display of remorse. He is a man executing a strictly defined chore. He walks directly through the heavy pooling blood, the deep treads of his heavy work boots leaving distinct crimson tracks across the floorboards. He leaves the townhouse momentarily and returns carrying a massive, heavy-duty black plastic storage tote. He brought it specifically for this exact logistical purpose. He grabs the heavy, limp weight of his fiancée. He drags her across the living room, smearing the floor, and forces her body into the dark, rigid plastic container. It is a tight fit. He has to apply physical pressure to fold her inside. He forces the lid down and snaps the plastic latches shut. The horror of the blood-soaked room is staggering, but he ignores the crimson splatter decorating the walls and ceiling. He does not intend to clean it. He has outsourced that specific task to a terrified woman waiting hundreds of miles away in Idaho. He walks into the bathroom and washes his hands. He walks back into the slaughterhouse of a living room and scoops the toddler out of the playpen, balancing the child on his hip. He grabs his keys. He drags the heavy black tote out the front door, the plastic scraping loudly against the concrete step. He hoists it over the tailgate and into the bed of his truck, sliding it alongside his farrier tools, his ropes, and his heavy equipment. He opens the rear passenger door and secures the baby in her car seat. He climbs behind the wheel and starts the engine. He drives the 15 miles back to his mother's ranch in Florissant. The afternoon sun begins to dip below the mountain ridge, casting long shadows across the icy asphalt. He parks the truck. He unbuckles his daughter, walks inside the warm house, and sits down at a dining table laden with roasted turkey, stuffing, and cranberry sauce. He is surrounded by his extended family. He smiles. He bows his head. He gives thanks for the meal. Outside, the mountain temperature rapidly drops below freezing, and the black plastic tote sits silently in the bed of his pickup truck. Then, a digital ghost appeared. On November 25th, 3 days after the fatal strike in the living room, a brief series of text messages originated from the missing woman's cell phone. One pinged the dispatch office at her aviation employer. The message bluntly stated she would not be coming into work for the upcoming week. Another text was sent to the farrier, claiming she was traveling out of state to check on her grandmother. The phrasing was entirely wrong. It lacked her usual cadence, her specific, familiar syntax. It was stilted, hollow, and alarmingly brief. It did not read like the communications of a meticulous aviation instructor responsible for complex flight schedules. It read like a crude impersonation. Technology leaves an indelible footprint. When law enforcement eventually pulled the cellular data, they discovered a geographic anomaly that defied all logic. The Sunday text messages did not originate from the high altitudes of Colorado. The cellular ping registered off a tower in Gooding, Idaho, nearly 600 miles northwest of Woodland Park. It was a grueling 10-hour drive across desolate state lines. The physical logistics simply did not align. How could a mother, supposedly walking away from her life, traverse 3 states without her vehicles? Both her cars remained parked, frozen and stationary, in the driveway of her complex. The police executed a formal welfare check at the townhouse. Officers breached the front door and stepped into a space that felt less like a home and more like a vacuum. The ambient temperature was cold. The air held the faint, stale scent of untouched cinnamon rolls resting on the kitchen counter. Her luggage, her makeup bag, her purse, all vanished. Yet the scene completely lacked the chaotic debris of a sudden flight or a violent struggle. The living room floor was immaculately clean, too clean. It smelled faintly of harsh chemical solvents, masking the metallic odor of violence that had saturated the room just days prior. The visual emptiness was deeply unsettling to the responding officers. The baby's brightly colored toys sat perfectly aligned in the playpen, completely undisturbed. People do not simply evaporate, leaving behind a cold oven and perfectly staged furniture. Teller County fractured under the weight of the disappearance. The quiet, idyllic mountain sanctuary dissolved into a landscape of paranoia. Faded missing person posters plastered every available surface, taped to the glass doors of the local Safeway, pinned to telephone poles along the icy highways, stacked by the registers of the hardware store. The brittle winter wind tore at the edges of the paper. In the grocery aisles and the coffee shops, the whispers grew louder. A professional woman does not abandon a 1-year-old child to vanish into the frozen wilderness. The physical search was daunting. Pike National Forest spans over 1 million acres of dense pine, jagged ravines, and unforgiving terrain. Search and rescue teams deployed K-9 units. Helicopters swept low over the tree line, scanning for any disruption in the snowpack. Every passing snowstorm threatened to bury potential evidence under feet of fresh powder. The community looked at their neighbors with newfound suspicion. The isolation of the mountains, once a major selling point for the residents, suddenly felt like a massive, impenetrable trap. Everyone knew everyone, which meant someone was lying. As the physical search intensified, a glaring void materialized at the center of the investigation. In December, the local police department held a highly publicized press conference. Cheryl stood before the flashing cameras, her voice breaking, pleading with the public for any information regarding her child. She stood entirely alone. The father of the missing woman's baby, the man who claimed to love her, refused to attend. His absence from the podium was deafening. It resonated through the community faster than any rumor. A desperate family mounts a public campaign. A guilty conscience stays off camera. When investigators finally sat across from him in the interrogation room, he presented a perfectly constructed wall of apathy. His demeanor was heavily guarded, his posture relaxed but completely unyielding. He offered a clean, emotionally barren narrative. He claimed the relationship had simply run its course. According to his official statement, they met on Thanksgiving Day, agreed to formally separate, and she willingly handed over the baby, her keys, and her firearm. He told the detectives she simply walked out the door and vanished, abandoning her entire life without a single backward glance. He presented the story not as a tragedy, but as a bureaucratic domestic dissolution. He offered no theories regarding her whereabouts. He offered no assistance to the search parties. He simply crossed his arms and let the silence hang in the interrogation room, confident that the immense Colorado wilderness would keep his secret, and absolute in his belief that the absence of a body equated to the absence of a crime. The Gooding, Idaho cell tower ping was the fatal miscalculation. A perpetrator can scrub a hardwood floor until it shines, but they cannot erase the invisible architecture of cellular telemetry. Agents from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the FBI abandoned the physical grid of Pike National Forest and pivoted entirely to the digital one. They subpoenaed the cellular data for the farrier's primary device. The records revealed a frantic, convoluted web of communication. He was not merely using his registered smartphone. He had activated multiple prepaid burner devices, purchasing them with cash and swapping them out in a clumsy attempt at operational security. He believed he was untraceable, but he made the fundamental error of carrying his active primary phone in his pocket, right alongside the burners. The telecommunication towers tracked the devices moving in perfect tandem down the local highways. Every single digital thread he spun over the preceding weeks led back to one specific node located in the high desert of Twin Falls, Idaho. The registered owner of that connecting number was Crystal Lee Kenny. Detectives traveled northwest, crossing state lines to confront the nurse in her own jurisdiction. They cornered her in a sterile, windowless interview room. Initially, she deployed the exact defensive narrative she had been programmed to deliver. She offered vague denials, feigning complete ignorance regarding the missing aviation instructor. But federal agents do not negotiate with proxies. They systematically dismantled her cover story. They placed the physical documentation on the metal table, the corresponding cell tower pings tracking her specific phone traveling down the interstate from Idaho to Colorado immediately following the Thanksgiving holiday. They mapped out the precise timestamps of the burner phone activity. The psychological pressure applied in that room was suffocating. The investigators isolated her, deliberately severing the emotional tether she maintained with the cowboy in Colorado. They outlined the severe federal penalties for accessory to murder. They reminded her that she had her own children to consider, children who would grow up without a mother if she absorbed the legal impact of his crime. The illusion of a romantic rescue dissolved into the stark, fluorescent reality of a lengthy prison sentence. The man she idolized was not coming to save her. He had positioned her as the perfect, expendable scapegoat. The facade completely shattered. The nurse began to speak, offering a blueprint of calculated depravity. She told the investigators she did not swing the baseball bat, but she was recruited to be the janitor. On November 24th, 2 days after the blunt force trauma in the living room, she received the final summons. She made the 10-hour drive south through a severe winter storm, navigating the icy passes of the Rocky Mountains. Her vehicle was loaded with an inventory of destruction, industrial bleach, heavy-duty rubber gloves, protective hairnets, and thick trash bags. She detailed her entry into the Woodland Park townhouse. The reality of the crime scene eclipsed the fabricated stories she had been fed. The violence had been absolute. She described a space completely saturated in human biological material. Crimson splatter coated the beige walls, pooled heavily beneath the sofa, and misted across the blades of the ceiling fans. It was baked into the grout of the faux stone fireplace. For hours, a trained healthcare worker systematically erased the biological existence of the mother. She scrubbed the baseboards. She wiped down the brightly colored plastic toys sitting in the playpen. The enclosed space smelled overwhelmingly of caustic industrial bleach, fighting against the heavy, metallic stench of oxidizing copper. She found fragments of the victim's teeth scattered across the hardwood and flushed them down the toilet. She collected the blood-soaked throw pillows, the ruined rugs, and a plush stuffed animal, shoving them into the heavy garbage bags. She worked until her hands blistered, stopping only when the surface layer of the apartment appeared completely pristine. Armed with this precise, horrifying intelligence, crime scene technicians returned to the seemingly immaculate condo. They no longer trusted the visual surface. They deployed chemical reagents, specialized ultraviolet lighting, and heavy crowbars. They physically dismantled the living room. When they pulled up the hardwood planks, the chemical spray reacted violently in the dark. Beneath the floorboards, settling deep in the narrow, inaccessible crevices between the wooden joists where a mop and bleach could not penetrate, they found it. Microscopic traces of human tissue and blood. The subsequent DNA analysis confirmed it belonged to the missing woman. The lingering theory of an abrupt, voluntary disappearance was definitively incinerated. The townhouse was officially reclassified as a homicide scene. The nurse's timeline pushed the investigation forward into the cold logistics of the cover-up. She directed law enforcement to Nash Ranch, a sprawling, secluded property in Florissant, where Patrick stored equipment and ran cattle. She recounted arriving at the ranch to find him operating a heavy front-end loader. He had retrieved the heavy black plastic storage tote from a stack of hay where it had been hidden since Thanksgiving afternoon. He used the tractor to transport the heavy container to an open dirt depression on the property. She stood by in the freezing mountain air and watched as he arranged the cordwood. He placed the heavy tote directly onto the pile. He added the garbage bags, filled with the blood-soaked rugs, the pillows, and the cleaning supplies from the townhouse. He saturated the entire mound in liquid accelerant. He ignited the pile. The fire burned violently, the flames reaching high into the winter sky. She described the thick, black, toxic smoke rolling off the burn pit as the industrial plastic melted down. The smell of gasoline, combined with incinerating organic matter, permeated the rural landscape. As the fire consumed the evidence, the farrier remained completely detached. He used a heavy metal rake to churn the coals, ensuring the core temperature remained high enough to compromise dense bone. When the fire finally burned down to gray ash, he shoveled the remains into fresh garbage bags. He would later dispose of them in a commercial dumpster, erasing the final physical traces of his fiancée. Standing next to the smoldering pit, he casually handed the dead woman's cellular device to the nurse. He issued strict instructions to drive the phone back to Idaho and fire off the decoy text messages to her employer. A final, calculated maneuver to stall the inevitable search. The methodical dismantling of the alibi was complete. The digital data, the biological residue beneath the floorboards, and a cooperating accomplice formed an inescapable net. The quiet, stoic rancher had spent weeks digging a grave, entirely unaware that the authorities were already standing at the edge of it. The trial commenced in late 2019, overwhelming the small Teller County courthouse. Patrick sat at the defense table with the same rigid, expressionless posture he maintained on his ranch. He anticipated a weak circumstantial case. He was wrong. The prosecution systematically buried him under a mountain of digital telemetry and microscopic biology. The definitive turning point arrived when the Idaho nurse took the stand. She laid out the entire conspiracy in grueling detail, from the initial psychological grooming to the horrific cleanup and the destruction of the black tote. The defense scrambled to dismantle her credibility, framing her as a desperate accomplice lying to secure a plea deal. But her narrative perfectly matched the forensic reality. The invisible blood and the synchronized cellular tracking could not be cross-examined. It took the jury less than 4 hours to shatter the defendant's facade. They returned a guilty verdict on all counts, including first-degree murder. The judge handed down a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 156 years. The man who obsessed over boundaries and dominance was permanently stripped of the one thing he valued above all else, his absolute control. The gated acreage in Cherokee County is quiet once again, but the heavy silence that blankets the property is no longer a symbol of peace. It is the echo of total, irreversible ruin. A sprawling farm, originally purchased to build a lasting legacy, ultimately served as a slaughterhouse and a makeshift crematorium. A brilliant mind was reduced to fragments of bone, all to satisfy a horrific, calculated greed. The land endures, but a family was completely incinerated from the inside out. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. A brilliant law student dedicates her life to defending the innocent, while the man next door dedicates his to planning the perfect murder. They shared a wall, they shared classrooms at a prestigious university, but behind his quiet, awkward demeanor was a methodical predator, watching her every move through a stolen camera. This wasn't a random attack in a dark alley. This was a slaughter engineered by a legal mind, one that almost outsmarted the justice system, until a garbage truck failed to run its route. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Macon, Georgia, sits right in the center of the state, a city defined by historic Southern architecture and a thick, suffocating summer humidity that clings to the skin. It is also the home of the Mercer University School of Law. For the ambitious students navigating its rigorous programs, the pressure is relentless. They are trained to dissect evidence, understand the criminal mind, and master the intricate mechanics of the justice system. The Barristers Hall apartment complex, a modest, slightly weathered building sitting just across the street from the campus, served as a convenient sanctuary for these exhausted future attorneys. Lauren Giddings was the brightest light in that demanding environment. At 27 years old, the Maryland native carried a quiet but undeniable gravity. Raised in a fiercely close-knit family, she grew up playing softball, radiating an easy, natural athleticism. After earning her undergraduate degree, she set her sights on Mercer with a specific, unwavering mission. Lauren did not want a lucrative corporate law career. She was driven by a profound, genuine empathy, determined to become a public defender. She wanted to stand in court for the marginalized, the broken, and the forgotten. Classmates gravitated toward her because she was the rare type of person who genuinely listened, remembering the smallest details about people's lives and ensuring no one ever felt invisible. In the sweltering early summer of 2011, she had just graduated and was spending her days locked in a grueling study routine for the upcoming bar exam. She was standing exactly on the precipice of the life she had spent years building. Living right next door, sharing the exact same floor plan, was 25-year-old Stephen McDaniel. On a roster, Stephen was a peer, another recent law school graduate preparing for the bar. In reality, he occupied a completely different universe. Raised in the quiet, affluent Atlanta suburb of Lilburn, Stephen was undeniably intelligent but fundamentally broken on a social level. While Lauren effortlessly drew people in, Stephen repelled them. He was infamous among his peers for his unkempt, disheveled appearance, his erratic mannerisms, and an intense, unblinking stare that made everyone around him deeply uneasy. He was the classic outcast, a man who rarely spoke unless it was to deliver a jarring, inappropriate comment that silenced the room. But his awkwardness masked a terrifying psychological landscape. Stephen's isolation was not just a byproduct of social ineptitude. It was a breeding ground for dark, festering fixations. Behind the locked door of his apartment, he immersed himself in the bleakest corners of the internet. He was obsessed with weaponry, violence, and true crime, viewing humanity through a cold, detached lens. He had absolutely zero criminal history. To the local police, he did not exist. To his professors, he was highly capable but strange. Yet the very institution teaching him how to uphold the law was simultaneously arming him with a dangerous toolkit. Stephen was meticulously mastering the rules of forensic science, police interrogation tactics, and evidence disposal. The thin walls of the Barrister's Hall apartments offered little true privacy. Lauren resided in apartment number 2. Stephen occupied number 3. Their living spaces were separated by mere inches of drywall and timber. They even shared an outdoor balcony. To Lauren, Stephen was nothing more than the eccentric guy next door, someone to politely tolerate in the hallway before turning the deadbolt on her front door. She was entirely consumed by her textbooks, her friends, and her impending move out of Macon. She had absolutely no reason to suspect that the socially inept classmate living on the other side of her bedroom wall was no longer focused on passing the bar exam. He was focusing all of his analytical energy entirely on her. The Federalist Society was the veneer of their interaction, an academic organization that required a modicum of professional decorum. Lauren served as its president, a position requiring organization, leadership, and a visible, bustling energy. Stephen, predictably, served as the vice president. It was an arrangement of convenience that allowed them to be in the same orbit without requiring a true interpersonal bond. Lauren viewed him with the professional tolerance one offers a difficult colleague. She was oblivious to the reality that for Stephen, the proximity of the Federalist Society provided the ultimate vantage point. While Lauren was busy networking, planning for a future in public defense, and nurturing her social circles, Stephen was conducting a silent, invisible audit of her life. He wasn't just observing her, he was cataloging her routine. He took note of the specific times she arrived home, which keys she used, and how long the lights in her apartment remained illuminated. The mundane details that Lauren dismissed as part of her daily grind were, to Stephen, data points in a project that had begun to consume his waking hours. He utilized the most intrusive of methods to bridge the gap between their two apartments. Stephen had acquired a small, high-resolution camera, the kind used for clandestine observation. He meticulously rigged this device to a long, sturdy pole. From the vantage point of his own apartment or the communal balcony they shared, he could extend this apparatus across the narrow gap to peer directly through Lauren's window. He spent countless hours in the dark, bathed in the glow of a small monitor, watching her sleep, study, and exist in the one place she felt entirely secure. This wasn't just a violation of privacy. It was an exercise in total psychological possession. His fixation manifested in a digital dossier that would later shock forensic investigators. He had scoured the deep web and public databases, compiling an exhaustive list of information regarding Lauren's background, her family, and her habits. He was not looking for romantic connection. He was looking for vulnerabilities. He knew the floor plan of her apartment better than he knew the interior of his own. He understood the layout, the locks, and the weaknesses in the building's security protocols. The relationship, if it can be called that, was a masterclass in deception. Lauren would occasionally bump into Stephen in the stairwell. She would offer a polite, tight-lipped smile, perhaps a brief inquiry about a class assignment. Stephen would respond with a rehearsed, socially calibrated answer, his gaze remaining fixed on a point just to the side of her face. Lauren never noticed the lack of warmth. She was too preoccupied with the pressures of her final semester. She treated him as a background character in her life, a slightly odd neighbor she would never have to deal with again once she moved on to her legal career. She did not know that her every movement was being synthesized into a plan. Stephen McDaniel had begun to view his own life as a series of obstacles, and Lauren Giddings had inadvertently become the centerpiece of his fantasy. He had moved beyond the phase of mere voyeurism. The camera on the stick was no longer sufficient. He started purchasing tools, not for school and not for a hobby. He bought things that could be used to breach a threshold, to neutralize resistance, and to handle a body. His descent was methodical. There was no sudden break with reality, no explosive manifestation of a mental health crisis that his peers could easily identify. Instead, there was a steady, cold solidification of intent. He stopped attending classes. He spent his days in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the precise moment when the circumstances would align. The Federalist Society, the law degree, the peer group, all of it became a shell he wore to move through the world undetected. Inside, the project was nearing completion. He had the keys, he had the tools, and he had the target. Lauren remained blissfully unaware that her next-door neighbor had already decided she was not leaving the Barristers Hall apartment complex alive. The countdown to June 26th began in the silence of his apartment, marked only by the flickers of her bedroom light through his surveillance monitor. He was simply waiting for the right kind of darkness. Macon in late June is suffocating. Even in the dead of night, the humidity sits heavy in the air, wrapping around the brick exterior of the Barristers Hall apartments like a damp woolen blanket. The temperature rarely dips below the upper 70s, leaving a sticky, oppressive atmosphere that permeates every shadow. It was the early hours of Sunday, June 26, 2011. Inside apartment number 2, Lauren was deeply asleep. She had spent the previous evening just as she spent most of her days, focused, tired, winding down after a grueling stretch of studying for the bar exam. The complex was entirely quiet. It was that profound, heavy 4 a.m. silence where the ambient noise of the city dies away, and even the low hum of an old refrigerator feels uncomfortably loud. Next door, in apartment 3, Stephen was wide awake. He was not studying. The psychological countdown he had initiated months prior had finally reached 0. He dressed meticulously in dark, non-reflective clothing. He pulled a mask over his face, obscuring his features and transforming himself from an awkward, socially inept law graduate into an unrecognizable, predatory threat. He stepped out of his unit and crossed the narrow outdoor threshold to her front door. There would be no forced entry tonight, no shattered glass or splintered wood to alert the sleeping neighbors. During his obsessive surveillance and planning, he had managed to obtain a master key to the building. He slid the metal into the deadbolt. A soft, metallic click echoed faintly in the damp air. He turned the knob, pushed the door open, and stepped into her sanctuary. The intrusion was practically silent. He navigated the familiar layout of her living space, a floor plan absolutely identical to his own, with practiced precision. He avoided the floorboards that might creak. He moved like a ghost down the short hallway, his eyes adjusting to the pitch black. He entered her bedroom. Lauren woke abruptly to a living nightmare. There was a masked figure looming over her bed in the darkness. The ensuing struggle was desperate, violent, and agonizingly quiet. She fought back with everything she had, She fought for her future against an assailant she could not recognize, entirely unaware that the hands gripping her belonged to the classmate she shared a wall with. The physical disparity and the sheer shock of the ambush were overwhelming. He pinned her down against the mattress. The tension in the confined room spiked into pure, suffocating terror. He used his hands to cut off her airway. The struggle was a terrifying exertion of kinetic energy. Short, chaotic bursts of movement, the frantic shifting of sheets, the desperate gasping for oxygen. But the apartment walls were just thick enough to muffle the tragedy unfolding inside. No neighbors woke. No one called the police. The frantic resistance eventually gave way to a horrific, permanent stillness. The fight ended. The oppressive Macon humidity remained, but the bright, ambitious life inside apartment number 2 had been violently extinguished. It was approximately 4:30 in the morning. Stephen was now standing in the dark, breathing heavily, entirely alone with her body. The adrenaline of the assault began to ebb, rapidly replaced by a cold, clinical detachment. He did not panic. He did not immediately flee the scene. The extensive education he was supposed to use to defend clients in a courtroom was now being ruthlessly applied to a murder scene. He knew the apartment complex would soon wake up. He knew that attempting to drag a body out to his car in the morning light was a guaranteed invitation to a lethal injection gurney. He had to wait. He moved Lauren's remains into the bathroom, placing her inside the bathtub to contain the biological evidence of his crime. Then, he simply existed in her space. He waited as the sun rose over Georgia, casting light through the blinds he kept tightly drawn. He waited as the ambient sounds of the city and the complex bled through the thin walls. He could hear other law students waking up, walking down the exterior stairs, and leaving for the library. He sat mere feet away from the victim he had just slaughtered, demonstrating a level of psychological compartmentalization that defies basic human comprehension. For over a dozen hours, he monitored the environment, calculating his next tactical move with the exact same hyper-focused intensity he applied to his legal exams. He was in complete control. When absolute darkness finally returned on Sunday night, the second phase of his plan commenced. The cover of night provided the necessary shield for the grotesque mechanics of disposal. He retrieved a hacksaw, the specific tool he had purchased weeks earlier for this exact scenario. What followed in the confines of that small, fluorescent-lit bathroom was a display of utter depravity and calculated butchery. Stephen began the grueling, mechanical process of dismembering the body. This was not a quick or easy task. It required immense physical exertion, a strong stomach, and a complete sociopathic detachment from the reality of what he was doing. The sharp, metallic smell of copper filled the small space. He severed her limbs. He decapitated her. He systematically reduced the empathetic woman he had stalked for months into manageable pieces. The sound of the metal saw grinding against bone was muffled by the running water of the shower, masking the auditory evidence of the desecration from anyone walking by outside. He worked relentlessly, attempting to strip away any identifying features that could quickly link the remains to his missing neighbor. Once the dismemberment was complete, his focus shifted entirely to forensic countermeasures. He meticulously cleaned the bathtub, the ceramic tiles, and the surrounding metal fixtures. He deployed harsh chemical agents to break down blood and tissue, relying heavily on his deep dive into internet research regarding how to beat a police investigation. He scrubbed the scene, attempting to obliterate his DNA and any microscopic trace of the slaughter. He then wrapped the segmented remains in heavy plastic garbage bags. He packaged the torso, the largest, heaviest, and most difficult section to move, with particular care, double bagging it to prevent any leakage. In the dead of night, he carried the black plastic bags out of the apartment, his muscles aching from the exertion. He walked them to the large communal dumpster located at the far edge of the Barristers Hall parking lot. He hoisted the heavy bags over the lip of the green metal container, letting them drop heavily into the refuse below. He believed the city's sanitation schedule would handle the rest. The garbage trucks were due to empty the bins later that week. In his highly logical mind, the trash would be collected, compacted, and incinerated in a massive landfill miles away, obliterating the only physical proof of his actions. He returned to his own apartment, locked the deadbolt, washed his hands, and prepared to resume the facade of the strange, quiet law student. Day X had concluded exactly as he had engineered it. Monday morning broke over Macon with the usual sweltering heat, but the digital hum of Lauren's life had inexplicably flatlined. She was a woman deeply anchored by constant, daily communication, heavily tethered to her family back in Maryland. Following the joyous, chaotic blur of her sister's recent wedding, she was expected to check in continuously, to finalize her upcoming travel plans, and to lean heavily on her support system as the daunting bar exam approached. Instead, text messages went entirely unanswered, sitting unread in the digital void. Voicemails stacked up in the dark, greeted only by automated prompts and the sterile beep of a full inbox. The silence was immediate, jarring, and entirely out of character. For the first 24 hours, her inner circle tried desperately to rationalize the void. They assumed she was exhausted, buried under a mountain of study materials, or simply unplugged for a much-needed mental reset. But as 48 hours evaporated into Wednesday, that logical rationalization morphed into a suffocating, paralyzing dread. The social echo of her absence began to reverberate fiercely through the Mercer University community. Law students, typically consumed entirely by their own academic survival and the looming terror of final exams, began to look up from their heavy textbooks. Anxious whispers snaked through the library aisles, across the manicured courtyards, and into the local coffee shops. The Barristers Hall parking lot sat unchanged. Her car was still there, baking under the unforgiving Georgia sun, parked in the exact same spot she always used. A 27-year-old woman with deep community ties, a beloved dog, and a brilliant future does not simply walk away from her entire existence while leaving her primary mode of transportation behind. The collective anxiety finally peaked on Thursday, June 30th. Responding to desperate, pleading phone calls from her family, the Macon police arrived at the complex to conduct a formal welfare check. Uniformed officers climbed the exterior concrete stairs to apartment number 2. They knocked forcefully. They waited in the stifling humidity. The only response was the heavy, stagnant silence of the southern summer. Securing emergency access from the property manager, investigators turned the deadbolt and stepped cautiously inside the dark unit. The scene was chilling precisely because of its absolute, terrifying normalcy. There was no overturned furniture, no shattered window glass, no defensive wounds or blood spatter painting the beige drywall. The apartment simply smelled of old air conditioning and undisturbed, settling dust. Her laptop sat waiting on a desk. Her rigorous study materials were neatly arranged, paused mid-thought. Her purse, containing her identification and credit cards, was gone, along with her keys and cell phone, but the atmosphere felt entirely wrong. Law enforcement initially leaned heavily toward a theory of voluntary disappearance, suggesting perhaps the crushing pressure of the upcoming bar exam had triggered a sudden, unannounced retreat to clear her head. Her friends and family violently rejected that premise. They emphasized to the detectives that Lauren was fiercely responsible. She would never abandon her life, her pets, or her family without leaving a digital footprint or a quick note. As the official missing person investigation formally launched, the local community mobilized with frantic, nervous energy. Classmates quickly printed hundreds of missing person flyers, plastering Lauren's smiling face across downtown storefronts, utility poles, and campus bulletin boards. Volunteer search parties formed organically, sweating through their clothes in the relentless 90-degree heat as they combed nearby streets, overgrown vacant lots, and local parks. And moving silently, confidently through the absolute center of this desperate swarm was the man from apartment 3. Stephen did not barricade himself in his room to hide from the growing police presence. He displayed a terrifying level of psychological compartmentalization by actively embedding himself into the very search efforts dedicated to finding his victim. He accepted thick stacks of flyers from weeping classmates. He canvassed the neighborhood sidewalks. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Lauren's closest friends, offering them quiet, stoic nods of solidarity and faux comfort. Beneath his disheveled, famously awkward exterior, he harbored a cold, arrogant certainty. He was playing the ultimate role, fully convinced that the city sanitation schedule had already erased the grotesque consequences of his horrific actions. He believed the biological evidence was already miles away, safely buried under tons of compacted, incinerated refuse at the county dump. He was fatally wrong. His meticulous, heavily researched forensic countermeasures had been entirely derailed by a single, mundane logistical failure. When the police initially swarmed the Barristers Hall parking lot to conduct the Thursday morning welfare check, their network of cruisers and unmarked vehicles created a dense physical bottleneck. The city garbage truck, rolling heavily through its standard morning route, found the complex's narrow lot entirely impassable. Unable to navigate around the flashing lights and parked sedans, the sanitation driver simply skipped the pickup, planning to return on the next cycle. The large green dumpster at the edge of the property remained untouched, baking in the suffocating heat, holding its terrible secret. That same afternoon, a local news crew from WGXA descended on the complex to broadcast a live report on the missing law student. A reporter spotted Stephen loitering near the yellow police tape of the crime scene perimeter. Recognizing him as a direct neighbor, she pulled him aside for a quick, on-camera interview. He willingly stepped into the glaring light of the television lens. Wearing a baggy, oversized gray shirt, his hair wild and unwashed, he delivered a chillingly flat performance. He spoke calmly about his missing classmate. In a massive, subconscious psychological slip, he repeatedly referred to her in the past tense, noting that no one had seen her in days. He told the reporter he was simply a concerned friend, playing his part with unnerving, sociopathic detachment. Then, the live feed captured one of the most remarkable, visceral moments of psychological collapse in modern criminal history. Mid-interview, the reporter received a frantic, real-time update through her earpiece from the station producer. She turned her microphone back to Stephen and asked if he had heard the absolute latest development from the active police line. She explicitly informed him that investigators had just discovered a dismembered body part wrapped in plastic inside the complex's parking lot dumpster. The physiological reaction was instantaneous, violent, and impossible to fake. The arrogant certainty shattered in real time. The blood violently drained from Stephen's face, leaving him a sickly pale. His unblinking, predatory stare broke immediately, his eyes darting frantically from side to side as his highly logical mind tried to process the catastrophic, impossible failure of his master plan. His jaw literally dropped open. He emitted a high-pitched, strained gasp, a primal sound of pure, unadulterated panic. He asked the reporter to repeat herself, his voice trembling and cracking. As the crushing reality of the unemptied dumpster crashed down upon him, his knees buckled visibly under his own weight. He mumbled incoherently that he needed to go sit down, stumbling awkwardly away from the glare of the camera lights, clutching his head in his hands. He was no longer the brilliant, untouchable legal mind. He was a trapped, terrified animal, realizing on live television before thousands of viewers that his perfect crime was unraveling entirely before his eyes. The live television collapse was broadcast directly into the living rooms of Macon residents, but more crucially, it was viewed by the lead detectives at the precinct. The investigation pivoted instantly. The frantic search for a missing woman transformed into a focused homicide inquiry, with the crosshairs locking dead center on the man in the oversized gray shirt. Down in the sweltering parking lot, crime scene units processed the heavy plastic bags retrieved from the green container. Inside lay the torso. The brutal reality of the discovery settled over the investigators. The city sanitation schedule had partially executed the killer's design. Earlier trash collection cycles had already emptied the adjacent bins. The remainder of her body was gone, lost somewhere within a sprawling county landfill, buried beneath thousands of tons of compacted refuse. A massive, grueling search of the dump site would eventually be organized, but the punishing Georgia heat and the sheer volume of waste made it an agonizingly slow, ultimately fruitless endeavor. The community shuddered as the gruesome details leaked out. The paralyzing fear that had gripped the law school mutated into sheer horror. The threat was not a random drifter. The predator had been sitting next to them in lectures, taking the exact same exams, walking the exact same halls. But building a capital murder case requires more than a bizarre reaction on the evening news. Detectives had to systematically eliminate alternative theories to ensure the defense could not introduce reasonable doubt. They chased the necessary red herrings. Could it have been a violent local offender with a history of home invasions? Was it a transient passing through the nearby downtown corridor? Investigators pulled security footage from adjacent businesses and interviewed known criminals in the area. Yet, the total absence of forced entry anchored their attention firmly inside the building. The perpetrator needed a key, and he needed proximity. They brought the next-door neighbor into the interrogation room. What unfolded over the next several hours became a masterclass in psychological abnormality. He sat in the sterile, windowless room, exhibiting behavior that deeply unsettled even the most seasoned investigators. He locked his body into a rigid, unnatural posture, sitting perfectly upright, remaining virtually motionless for hours at a time. He stared blankly ahead, his gaze fixed on a point just beyond the detectives, offering only monotone, evasive responses. He thought his absolute silence was an impenetrable shield, a legal strategy he had absorbed in the classroom. He refused to break, challenging the authorities to produce hard, physical evidence. They needed a legal mechanism to keep him detained, while crime scene technicians dismantled his apartment. A preliminary sweep of his residence yielded the perfect pretext. Investigators uncovered an assortment of items stolen from other units within the complex: personal belongings, undergarments, and a stolen master key to the building. He was not just a quiet student, he was a serial prowler who had been systematically violating the privacy of his classmates for an extended period. Police formally charged him with 2 counts of burglary. It was a highly strategic maneuver. Those relatively minor charges slammed the cell door shut, denying him bail and buying the forensic teams the crucial hours they needed to tear down his physical and digital walls. The execution of the search warrants revealed a space scrubbed with chemical precision. The suspect had utilized heavy bleach and industrial cleaning agents, attempting to erase the biological narrative of the weekend. But flawless crimes exist only in fiction. Microscopic traces always remain. Technicians dismantled the plumbing, swabbing the pipes, and discovering localized traces of human blood trapped deep in the drains. More damning was the discovery of cardboard packaging for a specific brand of hacksaw tossed carelessly in his bedroom. The blade's listed dimensions perfectly matched the distinct tool marks left on the recovered cartilage and bone. The physical chain of evidence was rapidly assembling itself, anchoring the spotless bathroom next door directly to the plastic bags in the dumpster. Yet, the most devastating blow to his defense was extracted from his own hard drives. The suspect believed he was a digital ghost, operating under the arrogant assumption that dragging files to a virtual trash bin equated to permanent deletion. Cyber forensics experts easily resurrected the erased data. The recovered cache provided a terrifying descent into his methodology. Investigators unearthed the clandestine videos recorded from the camera fixed to the pole, showcasing his extensive covert surveillance of her bedroom window. The time-stamped files proved he had been watching her in the days and weeks leading up to the ambush. His search engine history read like a step-by-step manual for premeditated slaughter. He had queried the internet for specific techniques on avoiding detection, the exact decomposition rate of human tissue, and how to effectively bypass standard police interrogation methods. He had explicitly searched for information on whether a severed human torso would float in water. He had tracked her online activity, monitored her social media, and cataloged her schedule with terrifying precision. Every keystroke was a digital fingerprint of malice aforethought. The intricate web of physical evidence, combined with the irrefutable cyber footprint and his bizarre behavioral profile, created an airtight narrative. The brilliant legal mind had engineered a highly complex operation, anticipating almost every variable, except a blocked garbage truck. Stephen McDaniel, facing an insurmountable mountain of forensic and digital evidence, knew a trial would be a public dissection of his fractured mind. The defense had nothing, no alternate suspect, no alibi, and no logical explanation for the hacksaw packaging or the recovered surveillance videos. Those digital breadcrumbs were essentially a guaranteed death sentence in a Georgia courtroom. In April 2014, the arrogant law graduate finally surrendered to the very legal system he thought he could completely outsmart. He accepted a plea deal to avoid the execution chamber, officially pleading guilty to the murder of his neighbor. The mandate was swift and definitive: life in prison. Under the strict terms of the agreement, he will not be eligible for parole until the year 2041. There were no dramatic theatrics or prolonged legal battles. The courtroom proceedings were reduced to the cold, bureaucratic processing of a killer. He offered no genuine explanation for the slaughter, and no emotional apology to the grieving family sitting just rows behind him. He simply answered the presiding judge's procedural questions in that same flat, deadened monotone, officially sealing his own fate and permanently closing the legal file on the Barristers Hall horror. Lauren Giddings wanted to dedicate her life to the broken and the defenseless. Her legacy survives in the public defenders who walk into courtrooms every day, fighting for the justice she was so violently denied. But the Barristers Hall case leaves a lingering, deeply unsettling echo in Macon. It shatters the comforting illusion that predators only lurk in dark alleys or abandoned lots. Sometimes they hold advanced degrees. Sometimes they sit beside us. And sometimes, terrifyingly, they share our walls. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.